Own. It is just past midnight in a small apartment on the third floor of a building that has seen better decades. A young woman sits on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand, the screen lighting up her face in the dark. Own. She has read the same message 4 times. It says nothing dramatic. It says, "I think we should take a break." She does not cry right away. She just sits there very still, the way people sit when a piece of news has not finished landing yet. Own. Across the city, a young man is sitting on the floor of his own apartment back against the wall, phone face down beside him because he cannot look at it anymore. No, he sent that message 20 minutes ago. Own. He has already typed and deleted 4 different follow-up texts. He loves her. That part was never the question. The question was everything around the loving, the distance, the timing, the families who never approved. Own. The version of a future neither of them could quite picture together. He is 26 years old, and somehow on a random Tuesday night, he feels like he is living inside a story that is 400 years old. Own. Because here's the truth, most people never stop to notice. You already know this story. You knew it before you ever picked a side in your own love life. 2 people who should never have fallen for each other, fall for each other anyway. Own. 2 families standing in the way. A love that burns too bright too fast and asks an impossible question. Is this love worth everything it might cost you? This is not a story about a play you read in high school and forgot. Own. It is not a story about Shakespeare, the man with the strange ruffled collar in a painting. And it is not a story about 2 teenagers in tight speaking in rhyme. This is a story about why, after more than 400 years, Own. 2 fictional teenagers from a city in Italy still shape the way you fall in love, the way you fight for love, and the way you grieve when you lose it. Stay with me here, because by the end of this, Own. You are going to understand something about your own heart that you have probably never had explained to you clearly before. And somewhere near the end, we are going to come back to that young woman on the edge of her bed. Own. That young man on the floor of his apartment. Because what happens to them next is going to surprise you. We are not done with them yet, not even close. Let's go back. Not to Verona first. And further back than that, Own. To the very real history hiding underneath one of the most famous fictional love stories ever written. Verona is a real city. Own. It still stands today in the north of Italy with a river curling through it like a long green ribbon and tourists lining up by the thousands every year to touch the wall. Outside a particular balcony that almost certainly was never the one Shakespeare imagined. Own. Here is the part most people miss. William Shakespeare did not invent Romeo and Juliet. He did not even invent the feud or the poison or the dagger or the balcony. Own. He took a story that had already been told and retold for almost 100 years before he ever picked up a pen, and he made it unforgettable. Own. The story traces back to an Italian writer named Luigi da Porto, who in the early 1500s wrote a tale of 2 young lovers named Romeo and Julieta from feuding families in Verona. Own. Da Porto claimed he heard the story from an old archer he had met on a military campaign. Whether that is true or simply good storytelling, we will never know. What we do know is that a few decades later, Own. Another Italian writer named Matteo Bandello expanded the tale, and an English poet named Arthur Brooke translated and adapted it into a long narrative poem in 1562 titled The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. It was Brooke's poem, Own. Sitting on a shelf in London more than 30 years later that a working playwright named William Shakespeare picked up and transformed into something the world has never let go of since. Here's the part no school ever teaches you none. Own. In Brooke's original poem, the story unfolds over 9 months. The lovers have time, they court slowly, they marry, months pass. Complications build gradually the way real relationships actually do. Own. Shakespeare did something almost reckless with the material. He compressed the entire story into less than a week. 5 days Romeo and Juliet meet, fall in love, marry, lose each other, and die all inside one single unbearable week. Own. Why does that matter to you sitting here right now, centuries later? Because that compression is not just a writing trick, it is the entire reason this story still grips people the way it does. Own. Shakespeare understood something about the human heart that modern psychology would not have language for until the 1970s. The difference between falling in love and being in love. Psychologists eventually gave this a name, limerence. Own. It is the intense, almost obsessive, all-consuming infatuation stage of falling for someone. The stage where you cannot stop thinking about them, where your stomach drops every time your phone lights up, where the rest of the world goes a little quiet because all your attention has narrowed down to one single person. Limerence is real. It is chemical. It floods your brain with dopamine the same way certain addictive substances do. And critically, it does not last. Most researchers who study this place its natural lifespan somewhere between several months and 2 years before it settles one way or another into something steadier or fades away entirely. But Romeo and Juliet never got the chance to find out which one it would have become for them. Shakespeare trapped them inside the most intense 5 days of limerence imaginable and ended the story before reality had the chance to test it. That is not an accident. That is the entire design of the play. And it is also whether you have ever put words to it or not, and exactly what makes the story dangerous to misread, and exactly what makes it worth understanding correctly. Here's where Michelle comes in. Michelle is 42 years old now, married 19 years with 2 teenagers of her own. But when Michelle was 19, she fell in love the way Juliet falls in love. Fast, total, certain beyond all reason. His name was Daniel. They met at a summer job, and within 3 weeks Michelle had convinced herself this was it. This was the one. This was forever. Her parents were terrified. They had seen this kind of fast-burning certainty before in other people and themselves when they were young, and it had not always ended well. They tried to slow her down. Michelle felt in that moment exactly the way Juliet feels about her own parents. Like the people who loved her most were the only thing standing between her and the truest feeling she had ever known. I remember telling my mother that she didn't understand real love. Michelle says now, nearly 25 years later. I actually said those words to her. I cringe every time I think about it. Daniel and Michelle lasted 4 months. Not because the love wasn't real. It was real in the way limerence is always real while it lasts. But because underneath the intensity, they had almost nothing in common. No shared sense of what a life together would actually look like once the dopamine settled. When it ended, Michelle was certain her life was over. She remembers crying so hard she made herself sick. She remembers thinking with complete sincerity that she would never recover. She did recover. 2 years later, she met the man she would actually marry, and what she felt for him in the beginning was quieter, slower, less like a wildfire, and more like something that had to be built brick by brick over real time. It wasn't as exciting, Michelle says, but it was real in a different way. It was real the way a house is real, instead of real the way a firework is real. Here's the part most couples miss. The intensity of a feeling is not proof of its depth. Shakespeare knew that 400 years before psychologists had the research to back it up. Now watch what's actually happening underneath the poetry in that play. Romeo, before he ever meets Juliet, is utterly convinced he is in love with another young woman named Rosaline. He mopes through the opening scenes of the play, certain his heart is broken beyond repair, certain that Rosaline is the only woman he could ever love. And then he walks into a party, sees Juliet, and forgets Rosaline's name exists. Shakespeare put that detail in on purpose. He was showing you in the very first act exactly how unreliable the feeling of "I have never felt this way before" can actually be. This isn't a story about finding the one true love that erases every feeling that came before it. It isn't a story about a love so powerful that it justifies any risk, any deception, any rushed decision. It isn't a story telling you that if it burns hot enough, fast enough, it must be real. And it's a story about what happens when intense feeling collides head-on with real-world consequence, and what gets lost in the collision. Mark is 45 now, and he tells a different version of nearly the same lesson. Mark married young too. 23, to a woman named Christine he had dated for less than a year. Everyone told us we were moving too fast. Mark remembers, we didn't listen. We were so sure. Mark and Christine are still married 22 years later. And Mark will be the first to tell you they got lucky. We had the Romeo and Juliet feeling. He says the all-consuming can't think straight feeling. And it happened to be pointed at someone we were actually compatible with, underneath all that intensity. That's not wisdom. That's luck. I know plenty of people who had that exact same feeling pointed at the wrong person and it nearly ruined their lives instead. Mark's honesty here matters because it points at something. Shakespeare's play does not resolve, and was never trying to resolve. The play is not a guide for how to build a marriage. It is a portrait of a feeling so total, so overwhelming that it makes two teenagers willing to defy their families, fake a death, and ultimately die rather than live without each other. The question the play leaves hanging over every reader, every person watching their own heart do something similar centuries later, is this: when does that feeling deserve to be trusted? And when does it deserve to be questioned? Stay with me here, because the answer is more complicated than always trusted, or never trusted. And it has everything to do with the family standing behind both Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and the Capulet, who are not just background scenery in this play. They are the entire reason the love is dangerous in the first place. And the reason that feud has lasted as a symbol for centuries is that almost everyone eventually falls in love with someone their family does not fully approve of, for reasons that have nothing to do with the person they actually are. Olivia is 28. She fell in love with a man her parents have never warmed up to. Not because he is unkind, not because he mistreats her, but because he comes from a different background, a different faith, a different set of assumptions about what a life should look like. My parents aren't villains. And Olivia says carefully, they're scared. They have a picture in their head of what my life is supposed to look like, and he doesn't fit that picture. Even though he's a genuinely good 3 years into the relationship, Olivia still has not fully resolved the tension. Holidays are tense. Conversations get redirected. Her mother asks every few months in a voice that tries to sound casual and never quite manages it. Are you sure about this? And here's the part that connects directly back to Verona. The feud between the Montagues and the Capulets is never actually explained in the play. Shakespeare never tells the audience what started it. There is no inciting incident, no clear villain, no reasonable cause given anywhere in the text. And that omission is not laziness. It is the entire point. The feud exists simply because it has always existed. An old wound inherited rather than chosen at the younger generation is expected to carry forward without ever fully understanding why. That is exactly the shape so many modern family conflicts over love still take. Olivia's parents cannot point to one clear, reasonable objection to the man she loves. What they are really defending is an old picture of life inherited from their own parents that was never actually about him at all. This is the part no school ever teaches you. The Montague-Capulet feud is not really about Romeo and Juliet's generation. It belongs to their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation before that. No. Romeo and Juliet simply inherited a war they never started and never agreed to. Watch what's actually happening here, because this is the first pattern this story is going to reveal to you, and it will not be the last. Generational conflict over love rarely begins with the couple in front of you. It usually begins 1 or 2 generations earlier with a wound, a betrayal, a disappointment, or simply an old set of fears that got passed down like an heirloom nobody asked for. The teenagers standing in the garden under the balcony are not actually fighting their own war. They are standing in the middle of someone else's inherited and unresolved. This is not a story about families who are simply cruel for no reason. It is not a story about young love being automatically right, just because it is opposed. And it is not a story about old people who simply do not understand. It is a story about how unexamined history quietly shapes the next generation's chance at happiness, whether anyone intends it to or not. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we move forward. When Romeo first sees Juliet across that crowded party, he does not know her name. He does not know she is a Capulet. For one suspended golden moment, before either of them learns who the other one is, there is no feud at all. There is only 2 people who like the way the other one looks at them. The moment the names come out, Capulet Montague, everything changes. The feeling does not change. The facts around the feeling change. And that single moment, more than almost any other in the play, is the entire emotional engine of the story. 2 people who would have simply liked each other in any other context are instead forced to risk everything just to be near one another. Hold on to that thought, because we are about to step into the second chapter of this story. Not own. And it is going to take you somewhere you might not expect, into the actual psychology of why young love feels more intense, more total, and more world-ending than love often does later in life. It has very little to do with Shakespeare's poetry, and almost everything to do with the architecture of the human brain. Here's something that might surprise you. Helen Fisher, anthropologist who spent decades studying love using brain imaging technology, found that the early stage of romantic love lights up the same regions of the brain associated with addiction. Not metaphorically, literally. When people look at photographs of someone they are newly intensely in love with, a brain's reward circuitry, the same circuitry triggered by certain addictive substances, activates in a way that almost nothing else in human experience replicates so precisely. This matters because it reframes everything about how Romeo and Juliet behave. They are not simply being dramatic teenagers. On some level, they are behaving the way any human brain behaves when it has been flooded with the neurochemical equivalent of a drug. Decision-making narrows. Long-term consequences shrink in importance. The object of the obsession becomes quite literally the most important thing in the world. Romeo climbs a wall into his enemy's garden at the risk of being killed on sight simply to stand beneath a balcony and talk. That is not poetic exaggeration. That is almost exactly what the addicted brain does. It takes enormous risks for one more hit of the thing it craves. This isn't a story about love being a weakness or a flaw in the brain's design. This isn't a story telling you that intense love is somehow fake because it has a chemical explanation. And this isn't a story arguing that young people simply cannot be trusted with their own hearts. And it's a story about understanding the machinery underneath the feeling so that you can work with it instead of being blindsided by it. Clara is 25, and she has spent most of her adult life terrified of exactly this kind of intensity. She grew up watching her parents fight, not occasionally but constantly viciously for years before they finally divorced when Claire was 14. I used to lie in my bed and listen to them through the wall, Claire says. And somewhere in there, I think I decided that big love was dangerous, that if it felt that intense, it was probably going to end in something breaking. Claire has dated, but carefully, cautiously, always with one foot positioned near the exit. And she has never let herself feel the full force of what Romeo feels for Juliet in that first balcony scene, because some part of her associates that intensity with the screaming she used to hear through her bedroom wall as a child. And here's the part that connects Clara's story to something. Shakespeare could not have known he was writing about 4 centuries before the term existed. And psychologists call the emotional map we learn from our first experiences of love and attachment style. It is not something you are born with. It is something you build mostly without realizing it, based on how love and conflict looked in the home where you first learned what those words meant. Claire's nervous system learned early and thoroughly that intensity equals danger. That lesson did not stay in her childhood bedroom. It followed her into every relationship that came after. This is the first pattern reveal of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains so much of what gets misunderstood about Romeo and Juliet and about real love in general. The play is often read as a celebration of intense, immediate, all-or-nothing love. But underneath the poetry, what it is actually depicting is 2 teenagers from a city soaked in violence. A city where men draw swords in the street over an insult, where the prologue itself promises ancient grudge and civil blood before a single line of romance is spoken. Falling into a love that mirrors the only emotional register they have ever been taught. Intensity, all or nothing, life or death. Pay attention to this part, because it is easy to miss on a first reading. Romeo and Juliet do not fall in love calmly, because they have never been shown what calm looks like. Their entire world, the feuding families, the street violence, the culture of honor and vengeance surrounding them, has taught them that love, like everything else in Verona, is supposed to be total, immediate, worth dying for. They are not just falling in love. They are falling in love inside a city that has trained them to see everything, including love, as a matter of life and death. Brian is 33, and his story shows what it looks like when a grown man finally starts to unlearn that exact lesson. Brian grew up in a household where his father never once said, "I love you," out loud, where emotion of any kind outside of anger was treated as weakness. Brian married young to a woman named Lisa, and for the first 8 years of their marriage, he loved her the only way he knew how. By working hard, by providing, by saying almost nothing about what was actually happening inside him. "I thought that was love," Brian says, showing up, paying the bills. "I didn't understand that Lisa needed to hear the words too, needed me to actually tell her what I was feeling, not just demonstrate it through a paycheck." The marriage nearly ended. Lisa told Brian in the middle of what almost became a separation she felt like she was married to a stranger who happened to be reliable. That sentence broke something open in Brian. He started therapy mostly out of desperation, and it was there that he first heard the phrase emotionally unavailable used to describe himself. "It hit me like a brick," Brian remembers, "because I wasn't unavailable because I didn't love her. I was unavailable because nobody ever showed me how to say it." The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Lisa was at the kitchen table doing the dishes from dinner, and Brian sat down across from her and said, for what he believes was the first time in their entire marriage, 3 words out loud that had nothing to do with reassurance or logistics. "I'm scared," he said. "I'm scared I'm going to lose you because I don't know how to be the person you need." Lisa put down the dish towel and looked at him for a long moment. Then she cried. Not from pain, Brian says, because it was the first time in 8 years that he had actually let her see what was underneath. Here's the part most couples miss, and it ties directly back to that balcony in Verona. Romeo's love for Juliet is loud, kind, It is poetry shouted into the night air. Vows exchanged within hours of meeting, a marriage arranged the very next morning. It is in almost every sense the opposite of what Brian spent 8 years doing in his own marriage. Yet both stories 400 years apart are circling the exact same truth. Love that cannot be spoken in whatever form it takes eventually starves the relationship it is trying to protect. This is not a story about loud love being better than quiet love, or quiet love being safer than loud love. It is not a story about choosing one emotional style over another, as if love comes in a single correct shape. No, it is a story about the gap between feeling something and actually letting the other person know you feel it. A gap that left unaddressed can quietly destroy a relationship, no matter how real the underlying feeling is. Now, watch what's actually happening with Romeo and Juliet's secret marriage, because it is about to introduce the second major figure standing just outside the romance, quietly shaping everything from the wings. Friar Lawrence, a priest who agrees to marry them in secret, hoping the union might finally end the feud between their families. Friar Lawrence is in many ways the first marriage counselor in the play, and his approach is going to teach us something important about the difference between good intentions and good judgment, which is exactly where we are headed next. Nun Friar Lawrence is one of the most misread characters in all of English literature. Most people who encounter him in a high school classroom remember him as a bumbling, well-meaning old priest whose plan goes disastrously wrong. Not that reading is accurate, but it is also shallow because it misses the more unsettling truth he represents. Friar Lawrence is not a fool. He is an intelligent, educated man who genuinely loves both Romeo and Juliet. He marries them not out of carelessness, but out of a calculated hope that their union might be the thing that finally heals the feud, that love might accomplish what law and threat and civic authority had failed to do for generations. His plan makes a kind of sense in isolation. On paper, it even sounds wise, and it still ends in a tomb with 2 dead teenagers. This is the second pattern this story is going to reveal to you, and it is one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of human relationships. Good intentions without honest communication and genuine accountability are just as capable of causing damage as bad intentions. Sometimes more capable because the person with good intentions never sees the damage coming until it has already landed. Ryan is 38 and he recognizes Friar Lawrence. "That's my dad," Ryan says. "Exactly. My dad is a good, he loves us. Everything he has ever done for our family, he did with the best possible intentions. And he also made choices over and over on behalf of our family without ever really asking us what we actually needed. He decided what was good for us, and then went ahead and did it. And when things went wrong, he could never understand why we were upset, because he had meant well. Ryan's father made a significant financial decision when Ryan was 19, taking out a second mortgage on the family home to invest in a business venture he was certain would secure the family's future. He did not consult Ryan's mother in any meaningful way. He announced the decision as something he had already set in motion, because he was certain it was right, and because he could not imagine a version of the conversation where explaining his reasoning would not eventually bring his wife around to agreement. The business failed. The mortgage was nearly impossible to manage. Ryan's mother never fully recovered her trust in his father's judgment, and it quietly reshaped the marriage for the next decade. His father to this day still does not entirely understand what he did wrong, and he was trying to take care of them. Here's the part that connects directly to Friar Lawrence. The priest's plan fails for a very specific reason. Not because it is evil, not because he is negligent, but because it requires everything to go perfectly, and he never builds in any mechanism for things going imperfectly. When Friar John is unable to deliver the crucial letter to Romeo in Mansilla, there is no backup plan on. When Romeo gets the wrong news and rides back to Verona in grief, there is no system in place to intercept him, to correct the miscommunication, to keep the plan alive through a single complication. Friar Lawrence built a house of glass in a city where people throw stones for sport, and then he was genuinely surprised when it shattered, and relationship researchers call this kind of thinking the assumption of smooth sailing. A cognitive bias, where we plan for the ideal version of events and unconsciously skip the mental exercise of asking, what do I do if this goes wrong? It shows up everywhere. It shows up in couples who plan a perfect wedding and have never once talked seriously about what disagreements will look like in a real marriage. And it shows up in parents who picture the children they intend to raise without ever sitting with the children they might actually get. It shows up in friends who make promises in the warmth of an easy moment and are genuinely shocked when keeping those promises turns out to be harder than the moment made it feel. Megan is 29, and she remembers with painful clarity planning her wedding for 9 months with her then fiancé, spending hour after hour on flowers and venues and vows, and having exactly 0 conversations about money. Exactly 0 conversations about where they would actually live, and exactly 0 conversations about how many children they each wanted and went. They were so busy planning the event of getting married that they never once planned for the experience of being married. The engagement ended, not dramatically, but slowly and miserably, as the real-world shape of a shared life together came into focus and turned out to be something neither of them had really looked at honestly before. We had talked about everything on the surface, Megan says, and nothing underneath it. I think we were both a little afraid that if we went too deep, we'd find something we couldn't ignore. And we were right. We would have known. But finding it at the engagement party would have been so much kinder than finding it 3 years into a marriage. Watch what's actually happening with this small open loop we have been building. And because it ties directly to something Romeo and Juliet almost do right before everything collapses. Stunned. There is a moment in the play, not always lingered on in adaptation, where Juliet asks Friar Lawrence a version of the most honest question she has ever asked anyone. Standing in the friar's cell, facing a forced marriage to Paris that she cannot refuse without revealing her secret marriage to Romeo, she draws a knife and says in effect that she would rather die than submit. That is usually read as desperation. But listen more carefully to what she is actually doing. She is forcing an honest confrontation with consequence. She is saying, I cannot manage this alone. I need real help, not a plan that sounds good on paper. Odd. Give me something real or give me a way out. The friar gives her the sleeping potion instead. He gives her another plan. Another elegant paper thin, all dependent on perfect execution plan. Because Friar Lawrence is not a man who handles genuine desperation well. He is a man who handles it by generating more plans. And at some point in every real relationship and every real family, there comes a moment where generating another plan is the one thing that will actually make things worse. And the only thing that will help is honesty. Plain, direct, uncomfortable honesty about what is actually happening and what is actually possible. Walter is 64, married 37 years, and he says the moment that saved his marriage was the first time he stopped fixing and started listening. My wife Margaret had been trying to tell me for years that she felt invisible in our marriage. Walter says, every time she tried to tell me that, I came back with a plan. I would take her somewhere special. I would schedule date nights. I would rearrange my schedule. I was always showing her solutions because I was terrified that if I just sat there and listened to how bad it had gotten, I wouldn't be able to fix it fast enough, and she would leave. Walter pauses here in the telling of the story, and something shifts in his face. She almost left anyway, he says. She almost left not because I wasn't trying to fix things. She almost left because she needed me to stop trying to fix things and just be there, not just witness it. Just sit in it with her. That was all she was asking for, and it took me 32 years to actually hear it. The night everything shifted for them, Walter says, was the night he did not respond to her with a plan. She was crying at the kitchen table. Not dramatically, just the slow, quiet crying of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. And Walter sat down across from her and said nothing useful at all. He said, I know. I haven't been here the way you needed me to be. I'm not going to give you a list right now. I just want to sit here with you. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she said, that's the first time in years I feel like you actually see me. Here's the pattern. No. Here's the thing that connects Walter's kitchen table to Friar Lawrence's cell in Verona, and to every relationship in which love is real, but communication is broken. The plan is never the problem. The problem is the plan used as a substitute for presence. When we are uncomfortable with another person's pain, with the uncertainty of a situation we cannot control, with the nakedness of needing or being needed without a clear path forward, the plan is what we reach for. It gives us something to do. It makes us feel useful. It moves us away from the unbearable stillness of simply being with someone in a difficult moment without being able to resolve it. Friar Lawrence's great failing is not his intelligence or even his judgment. It is his inability to sit in the impossible difficulty of what Romeo and Juliet are actually facing and simply be honest with them about it. He cannot bring himself to say, I cannot fix this, and the world outside is bigger than my plans. The forces arranged against you are more powerful than any sleeping potion I know how to brew. He cannot say that because men like Friar Lawrence, well-meaning, capable, not accustomed to having answers, often cannot bear the weight of that admission. Now, we are going to slow down for a moment because we need to look at the character, who is almost never given enough credit in this play, and we need to look at the nurse. And the nurse is about to show you something about the difference between loyalty and honesty that is going to land, for many of you, somewhere very personal. The nurse has raised Juliet from infancy. She loves Juliet with a genuine physical, warm-bodied love. The kind of love that comes from having held someone when they were small and helpless and entirely dependent. She is Juliet's closest confidant, a keeper of her secrets. The go-between, who carries messages between the two lovers. Giddy and conspiratorial and utterly devoted to Juliet's happiness. And after Romeo kills Tybalt and is banished from Verona, Nurse does something that on the surface looks like kindness. She tells Juliet, who has just learned of Romeo's exile and is heartbroken in her room, that she should accept the marriage to Paris. That Romeo is as good as dead to her now. That Paris is a good man, a fine man, a better practical choice. She says it gently. She says it with love. She says it because she genuinely believes she is helping. Juliet in that moment realizes she has lost the nurse. Not because the nurse stopped loving her, but because the nurse is no longer telling her the truth. She is telling her what she thinks Juliet can survive, and those are not the same thing. Juliet says coldly, Thou my bosom henceforth shall be twain. You and my heart are now strangers to each other, and turns away from the one adult in her life she had trusted most, none. This is the small open loop that was set earlier in this story. And here is where it gets resolved. The question was who in this play actually tells the truth. The answer is almost no one. Friar Lawrence tells plans instead. The nurse tells kindness instead. The Capulet parents tell authority instead. Nobody in the entire play sits down with these two teenagers and simply tells them the truth about what they are up against and what it is going to cost. And that absence, that failure of honest, loving adult truth-telling is as responsible for the ending of this play as any poison or any feud. Think about the last time you chose to say something comfortable instead of something true to someone you love. Not to be cruel, not to be careless, but simply because the truth felt like too much to put on them in that moment. Because you were protecting them from something you were not sure they could handle. Most of us have done this, Most of us have been the nurse in one relationship or another, at one difficult moment or another, The question this play keeps asking quietly underneath all the poetry is whether that protection is actually kindness not, or whether it is just a gentler form of abandonment, We are going to sit with that question for the rest of this chapter before we move into the chapter that is, for many people, the hardest one, The chapter about conflict, about the moments in a relationship when both people are right and both people are wrong simultaneously, and about why some couples can survive that and others cannot, Liam is 31 and Jess is 29, and they are still together, which surprises both of them a little after what they went through 2 years ago. They had a fight, a single fight over a single decision about whether to move to a new city for Liam's job opportunity, that somehow became, over the course of several weeks, a referendum on almost everything that had never been said out loud between them. The fight was not really about the city. It was about whose career mattered more, whose family would be left behind, who had been making compromises quietly and resentfully for years, without ever naming them out loud. No, the move was the match. The room was already full of the fuel. I remember thinking at one point, Jess says that I didn't even remember what we were actually arguing about anymore. And it had turned into something much bigger than a city, And I didn't know how to get back to the original question. They spent 3 weeks barely speaking, moving around their apartment like two people sharing a space they no longer agreed to share. And then one evening, Liam came out of the bedroom holding a notebook, sat across from Jess at the kitchen table and said, "I think I've been keeping score in my head for years and never told you. And I think you've been doing the same thing, And I think that's actually what this fight is about." He put the notebook down. He didn't read from it. He just let it sit there as evidence that something had been building invisibly in private for a long time. That moment of honesty did not resolve everything instantly, but it was the moment the real conversation finally began. Not the conversation about the city, The conversation about the two of them, and what they actually needed from each other, and what they had been pretending they did not need, because naming it out loud felt too vulnerable. That is what Friar Lawrence never gave Romeo and Juliet, Not a plan, a real conversation, an honest one. None. One that did not end in a solution, but simply in two people finally seeing each other clearly enough to make a genuinely informed choice, We are going to carry that truth into the next chapter, which is about conflict, real conflict, the kind that every lasting relationship goes through, the kind that looks like it might end everything, and sometimes does, and the one critical thing that determines which way it falls. There is a scene in the middle of Romeo and Juliet that is not about love at all. It is about loyalty, about honor, about the kind of male pride that feeds itself on the perception of weakness in others. Cusho and Tybalt stand in the street in the heat of a Verona afternoon, The insults between them grow sharp and precise, the way insults do when they are not actually personal, but instead stand for something much bigger and older and more serious. When Romeo arrives, fresh from his secret wedding to Juliet, still warm with the extraordinary private knowledge that Tybalt is now technically his kinsman by marriage, he tries to stop the fight. He steps between them. He refuses the duel Tybalt is offering, He says in what amounts to some of the most politically dangerous words he has ever spoken in public that he loves Tybalt's name as dearly as his own, and that he has reasons for what might look like cowardice, but the reasons belong to the future. Not the present. He is trying in the most impossible set of circumstances imaginable to be a peacemaker Mercutio who does not know about the marriage, who cannot understand why Romeo is backing down, who sees only what everyone standing in that street sees: a man refusing to defend his own honor, draws his sword in Romeo's place, and everything happens very quickly, the way catastrophe usually does. Not with a long, slow build, but with one wrong move. And suddenly, everything is different. Mercutio is dead. Romeo, overwhelmed by grief and rage, and the old fury that the new wedding day has not yet had time to replace, kills Tybalt. And with that single act, the play's future collapses. The banishment follows immediately. The forced marriage to Paris is accelerated. Every plan Friar Lawrence might have made is now operating on a shortened, impossible timeline. One moment of grief-fueled violence, and the quiet future that might have been possible. The secret marriage eventually becoming public. The feud perhaps softening. The two families eventually forced to a peace they did not choose is gone. Here's the part most people miss. Romeo was not wrong to try to make peace. He was not weak for refusing the duel, but he was operating with information that nobody else had, making choices whose logic was invisible to everyone watching him. And he never explained himself. He could not. Explaining would have meant revealing the marriage at secrecy. The thing that was supposed to protect the relationship became in that moment the thing that made it impossible for Romeo to act wisely in public. Because acting wisely in public would have required revealing a secret he was still protecting. This is the chapter about conflict, not the dramatic, sword-swinging somebody dies kind of conflict, although we will come back to that in a moment. The deeper kind. The conflict that lives inside a relationship where both people are simultaneously right and wrong where the thing that is protecting you is also the thing hurting you. Where the secret you are keeping for good reasons is the same secret that is quietly making every public situation worse. Dr. John Gottman, who is arguably the most influential researcher in the history of relationship psychology, has spent decades studying couples in what he and his team called the Love Lab, a research apartment where they could observe couples interacting naturally, measure their physiological stress responses, and track those couples over years to see which relationships survived and which ones ended. The findings that came out of that lab changed how the entire field of relationship psychology thinks about conflict. Gottman found that the specific content of what couples fight about is almost never the real predictor of whether a relationship survives. He found that the way couples fight is everything. And he identified 4 behaviors that he called the 4 horsemen. And when all 4 of them appeared regularly in a couple's conflict patterns, the likelihood of the relationship ending was in his data extremely high. The 4 behaviors are criticism, which is attacking your partner's character or personality rather than the specific behavior you are upset about. Contempt, which is treating your partner as beneath you. Sneering. Eye-rolling. Sarcasm that cuts. Communicating superiority rather than frustration. Defensiveness, which is responding to every complaint with a counter-complaint rather than any acknowledgement of the original concern. And stonewalling, which is shutting down entirely, going emotionally and physically still, refusing to engage, because the flood of feeling has become too overwhelming to manage. Now look at the Capulet parents' scene with Juliet after she refuses to marry Paris, and you will see all 4 horsemen in less than 100 lines of text. Lord Capulet does not express disappointment or concern, and he goes directly to contempt, calling her ungrateful, a wretch, a disobedient thing. Lady Capulet stonewalls almost immediately, withdrawing her protection with a devastating, "Do as thou wilt, for I have done with thee." Juliet attempts to explain herself, but in the middle of the contempt being directed at her, her words cannot land anywhere productive, because nobody in the room is actually listening. They are all simultaneously armoring up. Here's what is heartbreaking about this scene and also clarifying. The Capulet are not monsters in this moment, they are scared. Lord Capulet arranged the Paris marriage to secure his daughter's future. He did it with genuine unfatherly love. He is watching her refuse what he believes is the best possible outcome available to her, and he cannot understand why, because she cannot tell him the real reason, because the real reason is the secret. And so, everything between them gets compressed into contempt and stonewalling, and the most useless possible version of the conversation they could possibly be having. This is the third pattern this story is going to reveal. Not conflict without information is almost always conflict about the wrong thing. When people cannot or will not name the actual source of their pain, the conflict migrates outward onto whatever surface-level issue is closest to own. A family's fight about dishes and money, and who forgot to call, and who showed up late. And sometimes those things genuinely matter. But often they are placeholders for deeper unnamed things that have not yet found their own words own. And Grace is 37, and she spent the first 3 years of her marriage fighting with her husband Patrick about his mother. Specifically about how often they visited, how long the visits lasted, none own. Whether they were expected to call on every holiday, whether Patrick's mother was allowed to simply show up without calling first. Those were the shape the fights took own. But what Grace was actually trying to say none, and could not quite find the language for, was that she felt like a guest in her own marriage. That she did not feel like Patrick was choosing her as his primary person own. That she felt like she was always third in the pecking order behind his mother and his job. She was not wrong own. And Patrick genuinely had not made the psychological transition that every marriage requires from thinking of his family of origin as home base to thinking of his marriage as home base own. And until Grace found the language to say that directly instead of fighting about visit schedules, the conflict had nowhere useful to go. They found their way through it eventually own. But not before Patrick's mother had become in both their minds the symbol of everything that was most tender and most painful in their marriage. She's a lovely woman, Grace says with a wrathful smile. And for 3 years own. I couldn't be in the same room with her without feeling like I was losing my husband. That was never about her. She just happened to be the thing I had words for own. What Grace finally said on a Sunday afternoon, when both of them were tired of fighting, and the apartment felt too small, and she had nothing left to protect, was this. I need you to choose me, not instead of your mother own. But I need to feel every day that I am your person, that I come first, and I haven't felt that. Patrick was quiet for a long time. Not a stonewalling quiet, a thinking quiet. He said, I didn't know I wasn't doing that own. I thought providing everything and showing up for everything was choosing you. Grace said, it is. But I need to hear it too. I need you to say it sometimes. Here's the part that ties back to Verona own. And in every production of Romeo and Juliet that has ever been staged, in every film adaptation, in every reading, in every classroom, people ask the same question about Lord Capulet's rage, in the scene where Juliet refuses Paris own. Is he a villain? Is he a loving father? And the answer that the text actually gives, if you listen carefully, is both simultaneously, in the way that people under extreme emotional pressure so often are. He loves Juliet own. He is also in that moment completely unable to hear her. The love and the deafness coexist, and it is the deafness that does the damage, not the love. Now here is the part where this chapter is going to ask something of you directly own. Think of a conflict you are in, right now, or have recently been in with someone you love. Not the surface level content of it, not the dishes or the visit schedule or who forgot to call. Underneath that own. Underneath the specific complaint and the specific response and the specific exchange that led to whoever sleeping on the couch or going quiet for 3 days. What is it actually about? What is the thing that doesn't have words yet own? What is the thing you have not been saying out loud? Maybe because you are not yet sure you are allowed to want it own. Or maybe because saying it would make it real in a way that would then require something of both of you that you are not yet sure you are ready for. This is not a comfortable question, and I am not going to pretend it is not own. But it is the question that every couple who finds their way through serious conflict eventually has to answer. Not the question about the dishes, the question underneath the dishes. Romeo at Tybalt's feet in the street own. His hands still shaking from what he has just done, does something that is almost unbearable in its humanity. He looks at what has just happened. The dead cousin, the broken piece, the exile he can already feel approaching. And he says simply, own. Oh, I am fortune's fool. I am luck's fool. I am a plaything of circumstances I did not choose and could not control. It is the closest he ever comes to genuine, a clear-eyed recognition of the situation he is in. He is not wrong, own. But he is also not entirely right, because some of what has happened here was not fortune at all. It was the accumulated consequence of decisions made in secret, in haste, own. Without adequate communication in a city where the emotional temperature has always been set too high. Here's what the next chapter is going to do. We are going to move forward into the last 24 hours of Romeo and Juliet's lives. And we are going to look at what actually happens in that tomb. Not as tragedy, not as poetry, but as a case study in what happens when communication finally completely, not catastrophically fails. And then we are going to bring in a body of research that will give you something you can actually use in your own relationships and your own family. Regardless of whether anyone in your life is drawing a sword or brewing a sleeping potion. But first, there is one more thing about the street scene that deserves to be said out loud, because it is a thing most people feel and almost nobody talks about. When Mercutio is dying, bleeding in the street, he does not curse Tybalt who stabbed him. He curses both houses, a plague on both your houses. Not on the person who hurt him, but on the entire system of inherited hatred that created the situation in which the hurt became possible. He is in that moment doing something unusual and necessary and almost unbearably human. He is refusing to simplify what just happened into a clear moral story with a victim and a villain. He is saying the whole thing is broken. Not just the person who held the sword, the whole thing. That is a very hard thing to say about something you love or someone you love, or a family you belong to. It is easier to find the villain, and it is easier to draw the clear line between the person who did the damage and the person who received it. It is much harder and much more honest to step back far enough to say maybe the system itself. The way we learn to fight, the way we learn to love, the things we inherited from the generation above us. Maybe that is what is actually broken. And all of us, every one of us involved, are both in it together and responsible for changing it together. We are going to carry Mercutio's dying words into the next chapter, because what they say about inheritance, about accountability, about refusing to simplify is exactly what the best of modern relationship science says too. 400 years after he said it first, the last act of Romeo and Juliet takes place almost entirely in a tomb. That choice is not accidental. Shakespeare, who understood the architecture of meaning the way a composer understands. Harmony is doing something specific by putting his final act underground in the dark, in a place built for the dead. Because the last act of this play is not about death in the way most people think it is. It is about what happens to love when every system that was supposed to support it has failed. And let's move slowly through what actually happens in those final scenes. Because the real story is not the poison and the dagger. The real story is the sequence of missed moments, failed communications, and small decisions that accumulate into catastrophe. Juliet takes the friar's potion and falls into a death-like sleep. Romeo and Mantua through a servant who genuinely believes he is telling the truth that Juliet is dead. He does not pause to verify. He does not think to contact Friar Lawrence before acting. He finds a poison. He rides back to Verona at speed. He arrives at the tomb before Friar Lawrence. Before Juliet wakes, before any possible correction can be made. He drinks the poison. He dies. Juliet wakes. She finds him. She dies. In between those two deaths, there is one moment that most adaptations either rush through or cut entirely. Romeo, holding the sleeping Juliet's face in his hands, notices that she does not look entirely like the dead look. Her cheeks still have color. Her lips are still warm. Some part of him somewhere underneath the grief almost sees it. Almost understands that something is not right about what he is looking at. And then it passes and he drinks anyway. That near recognition is the most heartbreaking single moment in the entire play because it suggests, not definitively but hauntingly, that the truth was almost visible to him. If only he had paused for one more minute. If only he had waited for one more piece of information before acting on the incomplete picture in front of him. Here's the pattern. Here's the thing that makes this scene resonate so deeply in so many different human contexts, centuries after it was written. Romeo is not undone by ignorance alone. He is undone by the combination of incomplete information and the absolute inability to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing. He cannot sit in the not yet knowing. He cannot wait one more hour for the situation to clarify. And he acts immediately on what appears to be true. And what appears to be true is the opposite of what is actually true. Relationship researchers have a name for this pattern too. And it is surprisingly common. And it is called confirmation bias in conflict. The tendency when we are in emotional pain and already certain about something to read every piece of incoming information as further confirmation of what we already believe rather than genuinely checking it. Romeo believes Juliet is dead. He arrives at the tomb believing she is dead. He looks at her and sees what he already believes, death, and the color in her cheeks cannot override the certainty he arrived with. He was in the deepest sense no longer actually looking. He was confirming. Anna is 33 and her version of this played out over a text message thread. She was in a period of uncertainty with her partner James. They had been together 3 years. Things had been tense for months. Anna had spent several weeks quietly convinced that James was losing interest, looking for an exit. One evening, James sent a message that said simply, "Can we talk tonight, Anna?" Reading from inside the assumption she had been living in for weeks, heard it as confirmation. That was the breakup message. That was him finally saying it. She spent 3 hours preparing herself emotionally, rehearsing what she would say, grieving the relationship before it had ended, building a wall. When James came home and sat down across from her, what he actually said was that he had been offered a job in a different city, and he did not want to take it without talking to her about it first. He was asking her, not leaving her. But Anna had spent 3 hours inside the wrong story, and for the first 10 minutes of the real conversation, she could barely hear what he was actually saying because she was still partially inside the story she had told herself. I remember hearing the words come out of his mouth. Anna says, and feeling this weird delayed reaction, like there was a lag between what he was saying and what I was receiving. I had to actually tell myself, stop, hear him, this is not what you thought it was. She pauses, and I think about sometimes what would have happened if I had acted on the story I told myself instead of waiting for the actual conversation. James, for his part, had no idea what Anna had been carrying for those 3 hours. He saw a woman who was quieter than usual when he came home, who looked at him a little strangely when he sat down. He did not know that she had already told herself a story about this moment and had to actively undo it before she could actually be present for the real one. This is the 5th pattern this story is going to reveal, and it is one of the most practically important ones for any real relationship. The stories we tell ourselves about what is happening in the silences, in the unanswered texts, in the quiet evenings. The things that are not said are almost never as accurate as we are certain they are. And yet we act on them as though they are facts. We make decisions from inside those stories. We build walls and prepare exits and set up defenses against outcomes that have not actually arrived yet. And in doing so, we sometimes create the very distance we were afraid of. Romeo's story in that final act is a compressed, crystallized, poetic version of something that happens in real relationships, in slow motion, over weeks and months, and sometimes years, and the incomplete information, and the inability to sit in the uncertainty and the immediate action from the worst possible interpretation. These are not tragic theatrical devices. They are ordinary human behaviors that most people, if they look honestly at their own relationship history, will recognize. Here's the part that goes deeper. Let's look at what Juliet does when she wakes. She wakes to find Romeo dead beside her. She does not have the luxury of the near recognition that Romeo almost had. She has the fully realized reality. The body, the empty vial, the complete and irreversible consequence of what has happened while she slept. She does not panic. She does not try to find Friar Lawrence. She does not flee. She is in those few final moments strangely, heartbreakingly calm. She kisses Romeo's lips, hoping the poison might still be on them. It is not. And she takes his dagger and makes a different choice. What Juliet does in that tomb is not, as it is sometimes taught, a romantic gesture. It is not proof that their love was perfect or worth dying for. It is something much more complex and much more human. It is the choice of a person who has built her entire interior life around one central relationship, one person, one fixed point, and cannot locate any version of herself that continues without that fixed point present. Clinically, some psychologists would call this enchantment, a relationship structure in which the two people's individual identities have become so merged that the loss of one creates a genuine psychological impossibility for the other. And Juliet without Romeo is in Juliet's understanding of herself not actually a real category. This matters because it is one of the places where the play shifts from romantic ideal to genuine warning. The love between Romeo and Juliet is real. It is also structurally a love that has had no time and no space to exist independently. A love that never learned how to be two separate people who choose each other. And rather than two people who have collapsed into a single desperate unit. They married within 24 hours of meeting. They spent a single night together before Romeo left. They have never had the experience of being apart and choosing to return. They only know togetherness and separation. And they have no scaffolding for anything in between. Elena is 26, and she spent 2 years in a relationship that she now describes as exactly this. We were together all the time. Elena says genuinely all the time. And at first it felt like that was love. Like that closeness was the proof that what we had was real. But over time, I started to realize that I had stopped being Elena and had become half of us. I didn't have hobbies I did alone. I didn't have friends who were just mine anymore. I didn't know what I thought about things until I knew what he thought about them. And when the relationship ended, I genuinely did not know who I was without him. Not in a metaphorical way, in a really practical standing in the grocery store, not knowing what I like to eat way. Elena spent the better part of a year after that relationship ended doing what she now calls finding herself back, rebuilding the individual person who had existed before the relationship consumed her. It was uncomfortable and sometimes lonely and often deeply disorienting. But on the other side of it, she says she has a relationship now with Derek, who she has been with for a year and a half that functions completely differently. We do things separately. Elena says we have our own friends and our own stuff and our own separate inner lives. And when I come home to him at the end of the day, I'm choosing to come home to him. Not because I don't have anywhere else to exist, because he's genuinely the person I want to be with. That feels completely different. Here's the thing. This distinction illuminates about Romeo and Juliet that almost nobody teaches in school. The love in this play is not celebrated by Shakespeare as a model. It is observed. It is portrayed with extraordinary beauty and terrible precision. It is given the full weight of the most extraordinary language ever written about love in the English language, and it still ends in a tomb. Shakespeare does not editorialize. He does not step out from behind the curtain and say, "Children, this is what not to do." He just shows you what happens with total compassion and total honesty when two people build a love on a foundation of secrecy, speed, and total mutual absorption in a world that has given them no safer alternative. Robert Sternberg, a psychologist who spent much of his career trying to map the actual structure of love, proposed that complete love, he called it consummate love, is built from 3 components. Intimacy, which is the feeling of closeness and connection. Passion, which is the physical and emotional intensity, and commitment, which is the conscious ongoing choice to maintain the relationship through time and difficulty. By Sternberg's map, Romeo and Juliet have extraordinary intimacy and extraordinary passion. What they have not had enough time or enough peace to build is commitment in its truest sense. Not the commitment of a wedding vow spoken in haste, but the commitment that comes from choosing each other, again and again across ordinary time, through circumstances that are less than extraordinary. They never get that chance. Most of us are building love in exactly the opposite direction from Romeo and Juliet. We take our time with the early stages. Not we are cautious. We hold back, we wait to see. And yet so many modern couples still arrive at the same deficit. Not of passion, but of intimacy. Not the closeness that comes automatically from spending time together, but the intimacy that comes from having been truly known, having said the uncomfortable true things, and having been received, having shown the parts of yourself that you are not sure are lovable, and having been loved there anyway. Hun Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy, says that what couples are really arguing about underneath every surface-level conflict is one of 3 attachment needs. Am I safe with you? Are you there for me? No, I matter to you. When those 3 needs are consistently met, she found couples can withstand extraordinary external pressure. When they are not met, when the attachment bond feels uncertain or unsafe, even small conflicts can become explosive, because they are always underneath arguments about those 3 questions. Juliet's last living moments are in a strange way the most direct expression of those three questions that the entire play contains. She does not ask to be rescued. She does not call for help. She is simply completely at the final edge of what she can bear to carry alone. And she makes a choice that is in her interior landscape, the only choice that feels true to the enormous weight of what she has loved. Whether that is beautiful or devastating or both simultaneously, and it is both depends entirely on what we bring to the reading of it. We are about to enter the final chapter of this story. This is where we come back to that young woman sitting on the edge of her bed with her phone, and that young man on the floor of his apartment. This is where we take everything the play has shown us about limerence and attachment, about good intentions and honest communication, about conflict and confirmation bias, and the stories we tell ourselves in the silences. And we ask the one question the play never actually answers, but the one that every reader, every viewer, every person who has ever fallen in love is really asking underneath all the poetry. Is it possible to love like Romeo and Juliet completely fully, with the whole weight of yourself and survive it? And what does surviving it actually require? Here is a question that Shakespeare never answers in the play, and that nobody who writes about Romeo and Juliet in academic journals ever quite asks directly. On what would their marriage have actually looked like if the poison had been delivered in time? If the letter had reached Mantua, on if Friar Lawrence's plan had somehow gone right, what would Romeo and Juliet have become? At 25, at 35, at 50? The question sounds almost irreverent. These are supposed to be eternal teenagers, frozen in amber by tragedy. Their love preserved precisely by the fact that it never had to live through the difficult ordinariness of a real marriage. But asking it is not irreverence. It is actually the most honest possible response to the story. Because every real person who falls in love the way Romeo and Juliet fall in love fast, and total and world rearranging, eventually has to live through the ordinariness if they are lucky enough to survive the beginning. Janet is 58, married 31 years to a man named Paul, and she remembers with startling clarity night she decided to stay. Not the night she fell in love, not the wedding, the night she decided to stay. Which was a completely different and, in some ways, more important night. They were 8 years into their marriage, with 2 small children, and the relationship had become, as marriages with small children often do, entirely logistical. Who is picking up which child? Who called the plumber? Who forgot to pay the electric bill? Who is too tired tonight? And who is too tired every night? The romance had not disappeared, so much as been quietly buried under the weight of ordinary life. One evening, Janet sat in the bathroom after the children were in bed and looked at herself in the mirror and thought with shocking clarity, I don't know if I love him anymore. I know I chose him, and I know I am here, and I know we have built something real. But I don't know if I feel what I felt. She did not leave. She also did not pretend the thought away. She sat with it for several weeks, carrying it quietly. And then one evening she told Paul, not as an accusation, not as a threat. She told him simply honestly, that she was worried they had stopped being a couple and had become 2 people running the same household, and that she missed him, the actual him, the person she had chosen. And she was scared that the missing had been going on for long enough, that she was not sure she could find her way back without help. Paul's first reaction was hurt. His second reaction was silence. His third reaction several hours later was to sit across from her and say, I missed you too. I didn't say it. I didn't know how to say it. I was afraid that saying it would mean admitting how far apart we drifted. I wasn't ready to look at that. They found a couples therapist. They started going. The first 3 sessions, Janet says, were excruciating. Not because anything terrible was revealed, but because speaking honestly, slowly out loud about the interior landscape of a marriage with a neutral third person listening is an exposure of a kind that most of us are never fully prepared for. Over time, through what Janet describes as the deliberate, unglamorous work of choosing each other again, from a starting point of honesty, then assumption, the marriage changed shape. Not back into the shape it had been at the beginning. That shape belonged to the people they had been at 27, and they were no longer those people into a new shape. One that fit the people they had actually become. None. It's better now. Janet says genuinely better than it was at the beginning, because it's honest in a way that the beginning never was. In the beginning, we were in love with the people we imagined each other to be. Now we're in love with the actual people. That's slower and less exciting and so much more real. Here's the thing about this that connects back to Verona, and it is the central lesson this entire story has been building toward. Romeo and Juliet are a story about love at its most pure and most impossible. Love before the weight of real life has had the chance to test it. Love in the protective bubble of extraordinary intensity. Love that ends before it ever has to become ordinary. And the reason the story still moves people to tears, 400 years after it was written, is not because we wish our love stories ended in tragedy. It is because something in the love itself, the fullness of it, the total commitment, the willingness to be completely seen and to see completely, is something every person who has ever loved anyone in any form recognizes and wants. The question is not whether you can have love that complete. You can own. The question is what you have to build around it to let it survive ordinary time. Arthur Aaron spent his career studying what he called self-expansion theory. The idea that human beings are fundamentally motivated to grow at one of the most powerful engines of growth is another person who expands our sense of what we are and what is possible. When we first fall in love, the self-expansion is dramatic and constant. Every conversation, every shared experience, every new thing we see through the other person's eyes expands who we are. Over time, the dramatic expansion slows. Not because the love is gone, but because the territory of mutual discovery has been mapped. The people who do best are the ones who actively and consciously create new experiences of mutual discovery within the relationship. New challenges faced together, new things learned together, new territories entered together, rather than waiting for expansion to happen spontaneously and then panicking when it doesn't. Romeo and Juliet never stop expanding in the play because the play ends before they have the chance. They are always in the territory of first discovery. And the rest of us, who have to keep living after the first discovery, have to learn something they never needed to learn: how to keep choosing the expansion when it no longer happens automatically. Let's talk about what that actually looks like in practice. Because this is the place where research meets real life in the most useful possible way. Liam and Jess, the couple we visited in Chapter 3, who nearly didn't survive the conflict about the city. They ended up not moving, and it was a mutual decision made after the real conversation that finally began, when Liam put the notebook on the table. They stayed. And what they discovered in the months after the conflict was resolved was that the relationship had become structurally different from how it had been before. More honest, less comfortable, but less brittle. Before we were careful with each other, Jess says. There were things we didn't say because we were afraid of them. After the things we didn't say got smaller, because we had proved to ourselves that we could survive the hard conversation. Not just survive it, but actually come out stronger on the other side. This is what John Gottman calls repair. The ability after a fight, after a rupture, after a difficult conversation that did not go perfectly, not to find each other again. Not to pretend the fight didn't happen. Not to avoid the topic forever because it was painful, but to reach across the distance that conflict creates and make the gesture, small or large, whatever the moment asks for, that says, I'm still here, I'm still choosing you, we are not done. Gottman found that the specific content of the repair does not matter nearly as much as the fact that it is attempted and received. And couples who survive conflict are not couples who fight perfectly. They are couples who repair imperfectly and keep trying anyway. Walter and Margaret, whose story we visited earlier, a couple where Walter spent 32 years offering plans instead of presents, and almost lost Margaret because of it, have been married now for 37 years. The last 5 years, Walter says, have been the best years of their marriage. Not because they have fewer problems, not because the external circumstances are easier, because the years of therapy and honest conversation have created between them what Walter calls a genuine fluency, an ability to speak honestly about what was happening internally in real time, without waiting for it to accumulate into something impossible to carry. Not. We fight now like people who know they're going to make up, Walter says. Not because we go easy on each other. We're honest with each other in ways that would have scared me to death 20 years ago. Because we've proved to each other enough times, now that the making up is real, the coming back is real. There's no argument we've had in the last 5 years that I was genuinely afraid we wouldn't find each other on the other side of. That is the thing Romeo and Juliet never got to build. Not the intensity of the love. They had that in extraordinary measure. The trust that the love could survive the ordinary and the difficult. The proof built up over time and fought through conflict and imperfect repair at the other person would still be there on the other side of the hard moment. Now let's come back to that young woman on the edge of her bed, and that young man on the floor of his apartment. And because we have been carrying them since the beginning of this story, and it is time to find out what happened. Her name is Sarah, his name is Marcus. Different two people but the same shape of story that finds so many of us on a random Tuesday night that ends up feeling 400 years old. Era sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. She read the message again. She typed 3 different replies and deleted all 3 of them. And then she did something that is, and you look at it with everything we have learned over the course of this story, an act of extraordinary quiet courage. She called him, not texted, called. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral. There was a silence that lasted long enough to feel like a whole season. And then Sarah said, I don't want a break. I want to tell you what's actually going on for me. Can I do that? Marcus was quiet for another moment, and he said, yeah, I want to hear it. The conversation lasted 2 hours. It was not a comfortable conversation. Several things were said that were difficult to say and difficult to hear. The kind of things that once they exist in the air between 2 people cannot be unsaid. By the end of the conversation, they did not have a resolution. They did not have a plan. What they had was what Janet and Paul had in the bathroom at the mirror. A clear, honest view of the actual distance between them, a mutual willingness to sit in the uncertainty of it, rather than perform a comfort that was no longer honest. They are still together at the time this story is being told. Not because the conversation resolved everything, and because it began something that was more important than resolution. A practice of honesty, sometimes uncomfortable and always ongoing, that makes their relationship fundamentally different from what it was before that Tuesday night. That is the choice the play never gets to make. And that is the question Shakespeare leaves open by ending the story in the tomb. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the play's job is not to give the answer. It is to make you feel the question so deeply that you cannot help but carry it into your own life and look at it there. Here's the final thing this story wants to leave you with. There is a speech at the very end of the play, in the tomb, spoken by the Prince of Verona, the civic authority, who has been trying throughout the play to stop the violence and restore order. He looks at the 2 dead teenagers and at the 2 families standing on either side of them, and he says, all are punished. Not just the villains, not just the feud. All are punished. The families who kept the hatred alive. A friar who made plans instead of being honest. The nurse who chose kindness over truth. The city that normalized violence as an acceptable language for the expression of strong feeling. All of them. That speech, a play full of unforgettable speeches, is the quietest and in some ways the most devastating because it refuses the comfort of blame. It does not give the audience a villain to walk away feeling righteous about. It gives everyone in the room, characters and audience alike, a share of the weight, and that is in the end what the play is actually for. Not to teach you that fast love is false or slow love is true. Not to teach you that family should never interfere or that young people always know best. Not to give you a moral fable with clean edges and a comfortable lesson. It is to sit you inside the full unresolvable, achingly human complexity of love. Love that is real and also dangerous. Love that is total and also too narrow to hold. Love that is worth everything and also requires more than intensity alone to survive and to let you feel all of it simultaneously without resolution. Because the resolution, if there is one, is not in the play. It is in you. It is in the choices you make, in the silences between the messages you send and the ones you receive. It is in whether you choose honesty when kindness is the more comfortable option. not as in whether you sit with your partner, in the difficult stillness of an unanswered question, rather than reaching for the plan that makes you feel useful, but does not actually help. And it is in whether you build the thing that Romeo and Juliet never had enough time to build. Not the feeling of love which comes on its own and cannot be manufactured, but the practice of love, which is chosen daily ordinary time by ordinary and imperfect people who have decided together that the choosing is worth it. The story of Romeo and Juliet is not a tragedy because love is tragic, as is a tragedy because the world around them, the inherited hatred, the good intentions without honest communication, the secrecy and speed and total absence of functional adult support gave them no room to become what they might have become, given time, given peace, given the chance to be wrong about each other and repair it and come back, and given a Tuesday night conversation that lasted 2 hours, and did not resolve anything and began everything. That's the story. That's the love that changed literature forever, not because it succeeded, but because it tells the truth about what love requires, in order to succeed by showing us in devastating detail everything that gets in the way. Now go find the people you love. Tell them the true thing. Have the uncomfortable conversation. Make the repair. Choose the ordinary Tuesday, because the story that lasts is not the one that ends at its most intense. And it is the one that keeps going through the ordinary, and the difficult, and the slowly deepening honest, long after the intensity has settled into something that does not need a balcony to be real. The play ends with the prince's last words sending everyone home in grief and silence. The feud is over. Not because anybody chose peace, but because the cost of the alternative finally became impossible to bear. Lord Capulet and Lord Montague shake hands over the bodies of their children. They promise to build golden statues in each other's children's honor. It is in its way not the saddest possible ending. Not because there is no reconciliation, but because the reconciliation comes too late to matter to the two people it was supposed to protect. But the story does not actually end there. The story ends every time someone anywhere in any century, in any language sitting with any version of the fear or the love, or the conflict or the silence, picks this story up and carries it forward into their own life. That is what makes it immortal. Not the poetry, although the poetry is extraordinary. Not the plot, although the plot is precise. The immortality of Romeo and Juliet is the immortality of the question it never stops asking. Now, what are you willing to do to be truly seen by the person you love? And what are you willing to do to let them be truly seen by you? Here are the 5 things this story has tried to show you. They are not a prescription. They are not a therapy protocol. They are simply the 5 truths that 400 years of this story and decades of modern relationship research agree on. The first truth is this: intensity is not the same thing as depth. A feeling that you have never felt anything this powerful before is real and chemical and worth something. It is also not on its own a reliable map of the future. And give the feeling time and honesty before you let it make your decisions for you. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because the feeling only knows the present, and a life is built in time. The second truth is this: good intentions are not enough. Every person who contributed to the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, the friar, the nurse, the parents, even the prince, meant well. Meaning well without communicating honestly, without checking your assumptions against reality, without building in any tolerance. For things going imperfectly is a form of carelessness, dressed in the costume of love. The people who love you deserve not just your intentions but your honesty and your presence. The third truth is this: the conflict is almost never about what it appears to be about. Find the thing underneath the thing. Name it. Even though naming it is frightening, say it. Even though saying it requires a vulnerability that feels like exposure. Because the alternative, fighting about the dishes for 10 years while the real conversation waits underneath, adding heavier with every day that passes, is always more expensive than the original admission. The fourth truth is this: and the stories you tell yourself in the silences will make your decisions for you if you do not check them against reality. Romeo's last act is a perfect, devastating portrait of what happens when a human being cannot tolerate the uncertainty of incomplete information and acts from inside a story that turns out to be wrong. You have done a version of this. Own. So have I none. The practice of pausing, of sitting in the not yet knowing long enough to actually find out, is one of the most important and most difficult practices in any relationship. Own. The fifth truth is this, and it is the one that the whole story has been building toward. Love that lasts is not love that never faces the difficult. Own. It is love that chooses every time the difficult arrives not to stay in the room and be honest and make the repair and come back. Not perfectly, not without pain. Own. But again and again and again until the practice of coming back becomes the deepest thing between you. Deeper than the original intensity. Deeper than the first feeling. The kind of deep that only ordinarily, honestly lived can build. Own. Romeo and Juliet did not survive their story. Their story has survived everything. 420 years of human history, every possible adaptation and reimagining and translation. Every era's particular fears and assumptions about love. Own. Every generation's need to find itself reflected in the faces of two teenagers standing in a garden in the dark, completely certain they have found something worth every cost. The story survived because the question it asks never gets old. Own. Are you willing to love fully, honestly, at real cost in ordinary time, without the balcony, and without the poetry, and without the guarantee of a perfect ending? And if the answer is yes, which it is for most of us, most of the time, own, even when we are afraid, then the thing this play is really giving you is not a warning and not a model. It is a mirror, one in which you can see very clearly what you are capable of and what you still have work to do. Go do the work. Own. Make the call. Have the conversation. Say the true thing. Build the thing that lasts. That's the love that changed literature forever. Not. And it is waiting right now in your own life to change yours. Own. Let's slow down on the idea of limerence for a moment, because it is one of those concepts that once you truly understand it, not changes the way you read, not just Shakespeare, but your own history. Own. The psychologist Dorothy Tenove, who coined the term in her 1979 book Love and Limerence, described it as an involuntary state of intense romantic desire for another person. One that is characterized by intrusive thinking, own, a need for reciprocation, a sensitivity to any sign of hope, and a fear of rejection that can feel physically painful. The key word there is involuntary. Limerence is not something you choose. Own. You do not decide to fall into it, and you do not always decide when to fall out of it moment. It arrives and departs on a schedule that the rational decision-making part of your brain has very little influence over. Own. Tenove estimated, based on her interviews with hundreds of people, at limerence averages somewhere between 18 months and 3 years in length, before it either deepens into a more settled, secure form of attachment or fades entirely. Own. The variation is significant. Some people experience limerence for a few months. Others carry it for a decade. The factors that seem to extend it are interestingly not the factors most people would expect. Own. It is not how much the two people have in common. It is not how compatible their values are. Own. The single factor most reliably associated with prolonged limerence, according to Tenove's research, is uncertainty about whether the feelings are reciprocated, and ambiguity feeds the obsession. Clarity, even painful clarity, tends to resolve it. Own. Think about what this tells you about Romeo and Juliet. Their story, compressed into 5 days, is a story of absolute certainty of reciprocation from the very beginning. There is no ambiguity between them. From the moment they meet, own, they are both fully in. Own. And the absence of ambiguity, by Tenove's logic, should have allowed the limerence to settle faster, to move towards something more grounded, except that every external force in their world immediately introduces a different kind of uncertainty. Not does she love me, but can we exist together? Not is this real, but will the world allow it? The limerence does not settle because the external obstacle keeps the emotional intensity permanently active at it. Own. The way a wound stays inflamed when it cannot stop being disturbed. This is why the play's compression into 5 days works so powerfully on the emotions of anyone who reads it. Own. 5 days of sustained maximum intensity limerence with no internal ambiguity and only growing external threat creates an emotional experience with no equivalent in ordinary life. You feel it even reading it on a page in a quiet room. Own. You feel the particular quality of what it is like to love someone, with no doubt about the feeling and every doubt about the future. It is one of the most specifically horrible and beautiful emotional combinations a human being can inhabit. And Shakespeare puts you inside it and never lets you out. Now let's think about what that does to the young people who first encounter this play, typically somewhere between the ages of 14 and 17. Right at the neurological moment when the prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain responsible for long-term planning and impulse regulation, is still years away from full development. They are reading this story at the exact age when limerence is most likely to be occurring in their own lives for the first time. At the exact neurological stage when the brain is most vulnerable to the particular combination of intensity, certainty, and external threat that the play describes, no wonder it lands so hard. No wonder so many people carry it with them for the rest of their lives. The question is not whether the landing is appropriate. It always is. The question is what happens in the years after the landing. And the play is still inside you. But life is asking you to understand love in ways the play was never designed to teach. Here's a story that illustrates this beautifully. Rebecca is 45, a high school English teacher who has taught Romeo and Juliet 18 times over the course of her career. She says the conversation she most reliably has with her students, the one she never has to manufacture, not because it comes up on its own every single year, is the conversation about whether Romeo and Juliet's love was real. Every year without fail, Rebecca says, I have students who are absolutely certain it was real, and students who are absolutely certain it wasn't, and they argue with each other, with a passion that tells me much more about what they believe about their own love lives than anything they actually know about Shakespeare. The students who believe it is real tend to be the ones who are currently in the grip of their own first limerence. The students who believe it is not real tend to be the ones who have recently come out of it and are now in the slightly disillusioned, slightly defensive position of people who have learned the hard way that the intensity is not a reliable map. Both groups, Rebecca says, are partly right, and both are missing the more important question, which is not was it real, but what does real actually mean when we talk about love? Real in the sense of neurochemically genuine. Yes, absolutely real in the sense of proven by time and difficulty and mutual knowledge, built slowly across ordinary life. That's a different question entirely. She always ends the unit the same way. She asks her students to write not about Romeo and Juliet, but about someone they love, parent, friend, sibling, whoever, and to describe one moment when they felt genuinely seen by that person. Not impressed by, not admired by, seen, none. The quality of writing I get on that assignment, Rebecca says, is always completely different from everything else they write all year. Because they're not writing about Shakespeare anymore. They're writing about something true. She pauses. That's what the play does when you let it. It sends you back to your own life with a better set of questions than you arrived with. Here's the part that no one teaches in school. And it changes everything about how you read the early scenes of the play. When Romeo falls so instantly and completely for Juliet, he uses language that is extravagant, even by the standards of a playwright famous for extravagant language. He calls her a jewel, a rich gem, a snowy dove among crows. He says his heart has never loved until tonight. He says her beauty is too rich for use for earth. Every compliment is about her appearance. Every declaration is about how she looks to him standing at a distance across a crowded party in the light. He does not know her yet. He cannot know her yet. What Romeo loves in that first moment is the image of her, the visual impression, the face and the presence, the feeling that arrives through the eyes. A sensation is powerful and real, and will lead him to real love eventually. But it begins, as nearly all love begins, not with knowledge, but with perception, with seeing someone and wanting to be seen by them. And Helen Fisher's brain imaging research found that the early stage of romantic love activates the brain's caudate nucleus, a region associated with desire, reward, and motivation, but not significantly. The regions associated with affection or attachment, those regions come later as the relationship deepens. What this means is that the very first experience of love, the moment Romeo sees Juliet, the moment you saw whoever first made your heart do that specific thing, is not actually in the territory of the brain that handles deep connection. It is in the territory of the brain that handles wanting, Wanting and love are related but distinct. The wanting can be instantaneous. The love takes longer to build. None of this is meant to diminish the wanting. The wanting is beautiful and important, and it is very often the beginning of something real. But understanding the distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Not because so many relationships end, not because the love fades, but because the wanting, which was always going to change its shape as the relationship deepened, changes its shape. And one or both partners mistake the change in shape for the love ending, rather than recognizing it as the love maturing. Michael and Denise dated for 11 months before getting engaged. And Michael says the thing he was least prepared for in marriage was the moment about 3 years in, and he stopped feeling the wanting the same way he had in the beginning. I came home one evening, Michael says, and I looked at my wife, and I felt this terrible panic, because what I felt was comfortable, warm, present, but not the breathless thing from the beginning. And I immediately thought something had gone terribly wrong. He spent several months quietly convinced the marriage was in trouble, before he happened to read an article about the neurochemistry of long-term love that explained what actually happens to the brain's reward circuitry as a relationship matures. The dramatic dopamine spikes of early limerence give way in healthy long-term relationships to elevated levels of oxytocin and vasopressin, the chemicals associated with bonding, safety, and attachment. The feeling of safety, Michael realized, was not the absence of love. It was a different form of love, the form that required the other form to exist first, but that built something the other form never could have. I cried when I read that. Michael says with a slightly embarrassed laugh, which is not something I say out loud often. I cried because I had spent months thinking I was in a failing marriage, and what I was actually in was a maturing one. Nobody had ever told me those two things could feel the same from the inside. Romeo and Juliet never get to the maturing. Their story ends in the wanting, and in a way that is Shakespeare's most compassionate and most subversive choice, to give them a love so perfect and complete that it never has to face its own ordinary future. They are preserved forever in the wanting, which is beautiful, and also, if you look at it from the right angle, a little heartbreaking, because the maturing has its own beauty. And it is a beauty that requires survival to access. And there is one more figure in this play who deserves more attention than he typically gets, and that is Paris. Paris is the man the Capulet want Juliet to marry. And the interesting thing about Paris, if you read him carefully, is that he is genuinely not a villain. He is kind. He is respectful. He asks Lord Capulet's permission before pursuing Juliet. He gives Juliet time. He is by every objective measure available in the world of the play. A perfectly good choice. And he is also in the most painful possible way completely the wrong person for Juliet. Not because he is bad, but because she is already married to someone else, and even if she were not, the person she is would never be able to love the person. Paris is with the totality that love for Juliet apparently requires. Paris exists in this story as a very particular and very human kind of pain. He is the right answer to the wrong question. He is the practical solution to a situation that has never been practical. He is the person everyone around Juliet can see the sense of, and the person Juliet herself is completely unable to feel anything for. And the collision between those two realities is something so many people have lived on one side or the other. Naomi is 29, and she spent 2 years in a relationship with a man she describes as genuinely wonderful. He was everything a person is supposed to be. She says thoughtful, stable, kind, present, interested in me, good with my family. Everyone who met him loved him. Everyone told me I was lucky. She pauses, and I felt nothing. I felt friendship. I felt warmth. I felt gratitude. But not the thing that wakes you up in the middle of the night. And I stayed 2 years because I kept thinking the thing would arrive if I waited long enough. And it never did. The relationship ended gently, which in some ways, as Naomi says, made it harder than if it had ended badly. If he had been unkind or dishonest, I could have told myself a story that made sense. She says instead, I had to sit with the fact that I ended a relationship with a wonderful person because I wasn't in love with him. And I had to live with the guilt of that. And The way people looked at me when I tried to explain it, like I was being foolish or self-destructive or unrealistic about what love actually is. What Naomi was navigating without quite having language for it is one of the genuinely hard questions at the intersection of romantic love and practical life. A question the culture sends mixed signals about almost constantly. Is the feeling necessary? Is the wanting on the specific particular electricity of wanting this specific person a prerequisite for a life well shared with them? Or is it, as some argue, a kind of luxury of the modern age? A feeling that has been over-romanticized by 400 years of plays like this one. To the point where we dismiss genuinely good people, simply because they don't produce the neurochemical response we have been taught to expect. There is no clean answer to this. Anyone who tells you there is either in the direction of always trust the feeling, or the feeling is a lie. Choose the practical match is oversimplifying something that deserves more care than that. What the research does say is this. In long-term relationships, the specific quality of the initial spark matters less than most people think, and the quality of communication, friendship, and mutual respect matters far more. Couples who built their relationship on extraordinary initial chemistry but poor communication skills are, in Gottman's data, at significantly higher risk of unhappy or ending relationships than couples whose initial chemistry was more moderate, but whose day-to-day emotional attunement was high. The feeling is not nothing. It is also not everything. Now Paris deserves to be read with this in mind. He is not a symbol of the wrong choice. He is a symbol of a genuinely hard question. What do we owe ourselves? What do we owe the people we are with? And when is it honest to admit that a good person cannot be the right person? There is a passage in the play that most people read quickly without stopping on it and it contains one of the most precise psychological observations Shakespeare ever made. Early in Act 3, after the deaths of Mercutio and Tybalt and the announcement of Romeo's banishment, Juliet is in her room with her nurse when she receives the news. And her initial reaction before she has processed any of it, before she has had time to think, is rage at Romeo. She calls him serpent heart, fiend, angelical of feathered raven. She is furious the way people are furious at someone they love who has done something terrible. Not the cool fury of distance, but the hot fury of betrayal. The fury of someone who has trusted completely and been surprised. And then the nurse, hearing this, says something that agrees that Romeo is faithless, that Juliet is right to be angry. And at that moment, Juliet stops. She turns and she defends him immediately, instinctively, automatically. Not because she is no longer angry, but because the anger is hers and she will not share it. And because the complexity of loving someone who has done something you cannot excuse is something she will not flatten into simple condemnation, even when condemnation would be understandable. This moment is 3 lines long in the text, but it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated things in the entire play. Juliet is doing something that most people, in the grip of intense feeling, cannot manage. She is holding 2 true things simultaneously. Romeo has done something terrible and she loves him. Those 2 things do not cancel each other out. They exist together in the full and terrible complexity of what it means to love a real person in a real situation. Relationship researchers call this ambivalence tolerance, the capacity to hold conflicting feelings about someone you love without collapsing into a single feeling that erases the complexity. It is in practice one of the most difficult emotional skills a person can develop, and one of the most important. And because every real relationship eventually arrives at the moment where someone you love does something that is both genuinely wrong and also completely understandable, given who they are and where they come from. And the question of whether you can hold both those things, the accountability and the compassion, without choosing one at the expense of the other, is often the question that determines whether a relationship survives. And Patrick, Grace's husband from chapter 3, talks about the moment he understood this for the first time. It came not in his relationship with Grace, but in the history of his relationship with his own father, which he had always narrated to himself in simple terms. His father was absent, emotionally unavailable, too consumed by work to really know him. That was the story, and it was true as far as it went. And what therapy eventually gave Patrick was a for complete story one that made room for his father's own history, for the way his grandfather had parented his father, for the particular wounds that created the particular man who became Patrick's absent and emotionally unavailable parent. The story got more complicated. His father did not become innocent in the complicating. He remained genuinely absent in ways that genuinely cost Patrick something, but he also became in Patrick's understanding a whole person with his own losses and his own limitations. A person rather than a symbol of what was wrong with Patrick's childhood. The weird thing Patrick says is that getting angry at the whole picture, my father and his father and the whole chain of it, was actually easier than staying angry just at him. Because when you understand why someone did something, even something that hurt you, you can start to grieve it instead of just resenting it. And grief is a way through. Resentment just stays. This is what Juliet does in those 3 lines. She does not resolve the complexity. She does not forgive Romeo in the moment or excuse what he did. She simply refuses to flatten the complexity into something simpler and less honest than what she is actually feeling. That refusal is not weakness. It is one of the most difficult and most mature things she does in the entire play, and it happens to be something that modern relationship psychology has only relatively recently started to teach, explicitly as a skill. Here's something about grief that this play understands with extraordinary accuracy, and that most literary analysis of it never quite names. In the final act, when Romeo arrives at the tomb and finds what he believes to be Juliet's dead body, his grief is immediate, physical, and total. He does not deliberate. He does not go through stages. He is flooded, and the flooding is not weakness. It is what the unconditioned human response to sudden catastrophic loss actually looks like. And before the conditioned layers of social appropriateness and rational coping strategies arrive to organize it. Bessel van der Kolk, the trauma researcher and psychiatrist, spent his career documenting the ways that extreme emotional experiences, loss, betrayal, terror, grief, are processed not primarily by the thinking brain, but by the body. And his work showed that traumatic and intensely emotional events are encoded differently from ordinary memories, less as narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends, and more as sensory fragments, body memories, are pieces of feeling without context that can be reactivated by almost anything that shares a texture or a quality with the original experience. This is why grief, particularly fresh and shocking grief, so often feels less like sadness and more like a physical condition, a weight in the chest, a ringing in the ears, an inability to think in straight lines. Romeo standing in the tomb is not being dramatic. He is having a grief response so overwhelming that it overwrites the rational pattern recognizing part of his thinking. The part that might otherwise notice the color in Juliet's cheeks and paws. That's not a criticism of Romeo. That is an accurate portrait of what catastrophic loss does to the human nervous system when it arrives without warning. This matters for real relationships. Because grief, the grief of a relationship in serious trouble, the grief of a version of yourself or your partner that you are losing as you both grow and change, the grief of a dream for the future that has to be revised is something most couples navigate largely, without language. They experience the physical symptoms without recognizing them as grief. They feel the weight, and the inability to think clearly, and the tendency to act from the flooded state rather than the grounded one. And they interpret it as a relationship problem rather than a grief problem. And they go looking for the cause in each other, when the cause is in their own nervous systems. James, Anna's partner, not from chapter 5, went through a version of this when his mother died 2 years into their relationship. He became for about 8 months a person Anna barely recognized. Withdrawn, sometimes irrationally angry. Able to explain what was happening internally, prone to picking fights about small things, and then going completely cold when Anna tried to address them. I was drowning, James says. I didn't know I was drowning. I thought I was fine. I thought I was handling it. And I kept looking at Anna like she was the problem because she was in front of me. And my mother wasn't there to be the problem anymore. Anna stayed, not without pain. She spent several months, unsure whether the relationship was survivable, whether the man she had fallen in love with was still inside the person she was living with, What eventually moved things was a conversation with a friend who had been through her own parents' death and described the experience of grief in terms that gave James a framework he had not had before. She said something like, "Own. And grief doesn't come in waves the way people say. It comes in weather. Sometimes you have years between storms and you think it's over, and then suddenly you're back in the middle of it." And that was the first time I thought, oh, own. I am in the middle of something. This is not a me problem or an us problem. This is a grief problem, and those are different. Once James had the framework, Anna says he could start to participate in the conversation about it. He could say, "Own. I think I'm in the storm today. I need you to not take this personally." He could warn instead of just react. He could ask for what he needed, instead of punishing her for not guessing. Own. Grief inside a relationship is one of the quietest and most dangerous forces there is. Dangerous not because it is wrong or pathological, but because it is invisible to the person in the middle of it, who is often the last to name it as grief. Own. James could not name his grief as grief. He only knew that his nervous system had been flooded with the certainty of loss, and that the only response his flooded nervous system could generate was action. Immediate, irreversible action. Own. That is the cautionary truth embedded at the bottom of the tragedy's final act. Not love blindly pursued leads to death, but rather the flooded nervous system, without a moment of pause, without a witness, own, and without a single person able to say, "Wait, stop, breathe, look again," makes decisions that cannot be unmade, which is why the repair matters, which is why the return matters, own, which is why building in your relationship the explicit shared practice of saying, "I am flooded right now and I need to pause before I respond," is not a therapy gimmick, own. It is in its own quiet way a precise lesson that Verona learned the most painful possible way in a garden in the dark more than 400 years ago, own. Let's stay for one more moment with the question of what Romeo and Juliet would have looked like at 30 or 40 or 60. And because this thought experiment is not idle, it is actually one of the most useful things you can do with a love story. Own. Imagine them at 30. The feud resolved however messily, a real home somewhere, not Verona probably, not too much history there, children perhaps or the choice not to have them, jobs, responsibilities, own. In-laws who still glare across the table at family gatherings, the ordinary texture of a shared life. What do they have at these two people walking into ordinary life? They have extraordinary intimacy, own. The intimacy that comes from having been truly seen at the most vulnerable possible moment of a life. Not from having chosen each other across an impossible obstacle, from having a shared history that is quite unlike any other couple's, own. That is not nothing. That is actually quite rare and quite precious. What do they not have practice? They have never navigated a boring Tuesday together, own. They have never disagreed about something small and petty, and had to find their way back each other afterward, without the drama of a sword fight or a family feud, to make the stakes legible, own. They have never been too tired for each other, and had to choose to show up anyway. They have never had to rebuild trust slowly across ordinary time, after a small betrayal, because they never had small betrayals, own. Only enormous and structural impossible ones. The psychologist Esther Perel, who has spent her career thinking about desire and love in long-term relationships, says something that is relevant here, own. She says that love in the early stage is about having, acquiring, gaining access to this person who was previously unavailable to you, own. And that desire in a long-term relationship is about having, yet still wanting, about the mystery and separateness of another person remaining alive between you, even across years of intimacy. The paradox at the heart of long-term love, own, as Perel sees it, is that closeness reduces the distance that desire requires. The more fully you know someone, the more the novelty that fed the early intensity fades. The solution she offers, and it is not a comfortable one, own, not it is honest, is not to artificially maintain distance or manufacture mystery. It is to keep growing individually, to keep having inner lives that are genuinely your own and not entirely shared, own. Keep being slightly surprising to each other because you are both still in the process of becoming rather than finished and known. The couple that continues to have separate adventures, separate interests, own. Separate ways of encountering the world and then bringing those encounters back to the relationship. That couple tends to maintain desire more effectively than the couple that merges completely. 9. Because the merged couple has removed the very condition that desire requires. Romeo and Juliet, by the structure of their love, were already at risk of complete merger. 5 days total absorption. No individual lives that were not immediately redirected toward the shared one. If they had survived, the task before them would have been, in a sense, to undo a small amount of what their love had done. To re-individuate enough to remain genuinely interesting to each other across ordinary time. That is not a comfortable thing to say about a love celebrated as the greatest love story ever written. But it is honest, and it is the kind of honesty that is more useful than the comfortable version. If what you are trying to do is build something that lasts, the couples who appear most frequently in the research on lasting love, not happy ever after in the fairy tale sense, but genuinely sustained, growing, alive over decades, tend to share a quality that is easy to overlook because it doesn't make good poetry. They are interested in each other. Not in the early breathless, I am consumed by you way of limerence. In the ongoing curious, still finding new things way of two people who have decided that the other person is in some meaningful sense inexhaustible. Who keep asking questions rather than assuming they already know the answers. Who resist the temptation, and it is a real temptation, especially in the busy middle years of a long partnership, to stop paying attention because they believe they have already cataloged everything there is to know. Walter, 37 years in, says the thing he notices most about the last 5 years of his marriage is that he became curious about Margaret again. Not in spite of knowing her thoroughly, but somehow because of it. She said something at dinner once that completely surprised me, Walter says. Not dramatically. Just a thought she had about something, an opinion I had never heard before. And I realized I had stopped expecting to be surprised. And when the surprise came, it felt like a gift, like something I hadn't known I was missing. He pauses. I think I had confused knowing her well with knowing her completely. And those are not the same thing. Knowing her well means I understand her history and her patterns and her fears and her ways. Knowing her completely would mean she had run out of things to become. And she hasn't. She keeps becoming. I just had to start watching for it again. That watching, that ongoing, deliberate, curious attention is the practice that the story of Romeo and Juliet cannot depict, because the story ends before it has a chance to begin. But it is the practice that is in the end what love in ordinary time most requires. Not the grand gesture and not the impossible sacrifice. The small daily renewable choice to keep looking at the person in front of you as someone who is still, even now, even after all these years, in the process of becoming someone you have not yet fully met. And here's the part of the Montague-Capulet feud that most classroom discussions skip entirely because it requires sitting with a question that is uncomfortable to fully look at. The feud kills people not metaphorically, literally. The opening scene of the play, servants are fighting in the street. In the third act, Mercutio dies and Tybalt dies, and the violence is casual and accepted in a way that tells you this is not an unusual event in Verona. It is simply Tuesday. Death as a consequence of social conflict is so normalized in this city that the prince's attempts to stop it are almost treated as an imposition on a natural way of life. Yet, nobody in the play, not a single character, stops to question whether the feud itself is legitimate. Nobody says clearly and out loud, this needs to end because it is killing people who did not choose it. The closest anyone comes is Benvolio, Romeo's gentle cousin, who keeps trying to talk people down from fights and keeps failing. But Benvolio's peacemaking is individual, relational, non-personal, not a structural challenge to the feud itself, but a constant effort to manage its edges. The structure of the feud goes entirely unquestioned by the people inside it. This has a name in sociology. It is called the normalization of dysfunction. The process by which behaviors or systems that would appear clearly harmful from the outside become to the people inside them simply the way things are known. The people of Verona are not unusual in this. Most of us live inside at least one normalized dysfunction, a family pattern, a workplace dynamic, a social assumption that we have never fully examined because it was already present when we arrived, and because the people around us treat it as normal. Elena, the woman we met earlier, who spent 2 years in the merged relationship and had to spend a year finding herself back. grew up in a family where conflict was always performed at maximum volume, and her parents fought loudly and frequently, and usually resolved things within a few hours, and then the whole thing was treated as over. Nobody ever discussed what had happened. Nobody processed. The fight happened. Then it was over, and everyone moved on as if it hadn't happened. I thought that was how conflict worked. Elena says, I thought the volume was normal and the moving on without processing was normal. And I didn't understand until I was well into adulthood, that the reason I could never stay in a disagreement long enough to actually resolve it was because I had learned that disagreements ended. They didn't resolve. They just stopped. The discovery was both clarifying and destabilizing. You find out that one of the fundamental things you learned about how relationships work is actually just a thing your particular family did. Elena says, then you have to figure out, okay, what actually works? What do healthy people actually do when they disagree? The answer turned out to be simpler and harder than she expected. They stay in it. They don't perform it. They don't rush to the other side of it. They sit in the discomfort of the actual disagreement long enough to hear each other, and they find their way to a resolution that is real, instead of just a truce that lasts until the next eruption. This is the cultural inheritance that Romeo and Juliet bring to their love, a city in which conflict is always performed, always immediate, always external, and the love they build is inevitably in that image. Total immediate performed outward against the world. It is the only emotional language available to them. Now, one of the things Shakespeare does that is almost invisible in performance is give Romeo and Juliet their most honest moments in private and at night. The balcony scene is private. The wedding night is private. Their last conversation is in the bedroom before dawn. Private, hushed, and more real than almost anything either of them says in public. The public Romeo is all rhetoric and grand gesture. The private Romeo in the dark and talking to Juliet from underneath her window is someone different, uncertain, tender, almost hesitant. The private Juliet pushing back against his declarations, asking him not to swear by the moon because it is too changeable, is sharper and wiser than the person her family sees. They become more themselves in private. That tells you something about who they are, and something about the world they are trying to navigate. A world where honest private selfhood and performed public identity are almost completely separate. That split is not as historical as it sounds. Rebecca, the English teacher, makes her students think about it every year. I ask them, where are you most yourself? She says, at home. In your text with your best friend on Instagram. In class, almost everyone has a different answer for each context. And then I ask them, what does it mean that Romeo and Juliet can only be real with each other at night in secret? What does that tell you about what it costs in their world to be a real person in public? The students are quiet for a long time before anyone answers. And there is something worth saying here about the specific relationship between the play and masculinity. Because it is one of the places where Shakespeare was for his time, doing something genuinely unusual. Romeo in the early scenes is mocked gently but clearly for his emotionality. He is the young man who mopes about Rosaline, who stays inside when other young men are outside in the sun, who speaks in elaborate poetic conceits about love when the men around him are speaking in crude jokes about sex. Mercutio, his brilliant and volatile best friend, is partly a foil for this quality in Romeo. A person who performs the kind of easy, dismissive, ironic relationship with emotion that Verona's masculine culture rewards, and who dies partly because he has been trained to meet every challenge with a sword, rather than a conversation. Yet Romeo's emotionality is presented in the play as both his greatest vulnerability and one of the things that makes him capable of the love he develops for Juliet. The same openness that makes him ridiculous to Mercutio in the first act makes him capable of genuine intimacy in the third. This is not an accident. Shakespeare is making an argument not explicitly, but through the architecture of who survives emotionally and who doesn't. That the emotional availability that the masculine culture of Verona treats as weakness is actually the thing that allows for genuine connection and the performance of hardness that the culture rewards is part of what makes the tragedy possible. Brian, the man from chapter 2 who spent 8 years providing without communicating, recognizes Romeo and himself with uncomfortable precision. I was trained growing up to understand that my job was to handle things, to be the one who didn't fall apart, to lead, to fix. And that's not wrong exactly, those things have value. But what gets trained out in the same process is the ability to say, I don't know what to do here, or I'm scared, or I need something from you. Those things were never in the vocabulary I was given. He pauses. Romeo has them. Romeo has those words, and he gets teased for it by every other man in the play, and he's the one who actually loves someone. The parallel to modern masculinity is not subtle, but it is worth stating directly known. Research consistently shows that men in many cultural contexts have significantly fewer close emotional relationships than women, report higher rates of loneliness despite often being in relationships, and are less likely to seek help for emotional difficulties until those difficulties have become significant. The reasons are complex and structural, none, involving cultural training about what male strength is supposed to look like. Training that is in many ways not far from the training Mercutio received in Verona. The cost of that training in terms of relational health and individual well-being is real and measurable. And the literature, the story, the play, a cultural object that has survived 4 centuries of human reading, was already trying to make this argument long before the research existed to formalize it. Romeo's emotionality does not save him. The story is a tragedy and he dies, but his emotionality is also the thing that allows him to love Juliet the way he does, fully, openly, with every part of himself, accessible, And the question the play leaves you with, on this specific point, is whether a version of the story where Romeo had been trained to perform Mercutio's hardness would have been any better. It would not have ended in a tomb. It would have ended somewhere quieter and colder, and the performance of a life instead of the living of one. Let's talk about forgiveness, because the play essentially ends with it, or with the gesture of it, And forgiveness is one of the things most people understand least clearly, until they have had to practice it themselves, Lord Capulet and Lord Montague shaking hands over their children's bodies at the end of the play are not forgiving each other, in the full psychological sense. They are acknowledging defeat, They are coming to the end of something that has cost them everything. And the peace they make is the peace of exhaustion, rather than the peace of genuine transformation, And that distinction matters because the peace of exhaustion tends not to hold. It holds until the next provocation, the next slight, the next moment where the old wound has a chance to reopen. And genuine forgiveness, the kind that actually resolves something rather than just suspending it, is one of the most researched topics in modern positive psychology. And the findings are somewhat counterintuitive. Forgiveness, the research consistently shows, is not primarily for the person being forgiven. It is for the person doing the forgiving. The burden of sustained resentment, the physiological cost of carrying ongoing anger, the psychological cost of rehearsing grievance falls on the person holding it, not the person it is directed at. This is deeply unfair, but it is consistently true. Forgiveness is not an act of absolution for the other person. It is an act of release for yourself. It is also, the research shows, completely independent of whether the other person deserves it. Forgiveness does not require the other person to apologize, to change, to acknowledge the harm, or even to still be alive. These are all things that can accompany forgiveness and often make it easier, but they are not prerequisites. Forgiveness is at its core, the decision to stop allowing a past injury to actively organize your present life. Not because the injury wasn't real, not because it didn't matter, but because keeping it active is costing you more than releasing it. Ryan, the man whose father made the financial decision without consulting the family, spent almost a decade angry at his father in a way that, as he describes it now, aged him. I was carrying this thing everywhere, Ryan says. It was in every conversation I had with him. It was in every holiday. It shaped how I talked about him to my wife, to my friends. It was doing something to me that had nothing to do with him anymore. He had moved on and he thought we were fine. I was the one still in it. The shift came slowly and without drama. Ryan started therapy, not for this specifically, but for something else entirely. And in the process of talking about the something else, his father kept appearing. His therapist did not tell him to forgive his father. She helped him articulate what the anger was protecting, a grief underneath it for the version of his father he had wanted, and not had. And once Ryan could access the grief, the anger became less necessary as a container for it. Forgiveness followed, not as a decision, but as a gradual release. I didn't wake up one day and forgive him, Ryan says. I just started noticing at some point that I wasn't angry anymore, that I could sit across from him at dinner and just see him. A flawed, well-intentioned, limited man who did his best with tools that were never quite adequate for the job. And I could be sad about that without being furious about it. And the sadness was actually easier to live with than the fury ever was. The play never gives us this. The Capulet and Montagues do not reach the genuine release at the end. They reach the gesture, and perhaps Shakespeare, who had seen enough of human nature to know the limits of grand gestures, understood that genuine forgiveness is not the stuff of dramatic endings. It is quieter than that. It is private. It happens in therapy offices and in long car rides, and in the middle of ordinary evenings when something shifts inside you and you realize the thing you have been carrying has become without announcement lighter. Here's one more thing, and it is the thing that takes longest to learn, and that nobody teaches explicitly, and that is this. Love is a practice before it is a feeling, and after the feeling. What that means in the specific practical everyday texture of a real relationship is something like this. There will be mornings when you do not feel it. Not I do not feel it today. In the dramatic crisis sense of something has gone wrong. Just the ordinary flatness of a Tuesday morning when the coffee hasn't helped yet and neither of you slept well. And the to-do list is already enormous before the day has begun. And the person across from you is just a person. A familiar, known, slightly irritating person who left the cabinet door open again. And in that moment, the feeling is not present. The limerence is not present. The longing is not present. You are just two people sharing a kitchen. That is the moment the practice matters. Not the grand gesture, the small, renewable, almost invisible choice to orient toward that person rather than away. To say good morning when you could say nothing, none. To touch their shoulder as you pass, to ask genuinely how they slept. These are not romantic gestures. They are not the stuff of balcony speeches or tragic tombs. No, they are the actual building material of a shared life. The thousands of ordinary micro-choices that accumulated over years and decades become the deepest form of intimacy there is. Brian, who spent 8 years providing without communicating, and who then learned through the near loss of his marriage. A different way has a word for this. That he came up with himself, which he uses now, when he talks about what changed. He calls it showing up small. The big gestures are easy, Brian says. Or not easy but legible. You know you're doing a big gesture. You feel it. She feels it. And it's visible and it counts and it matters. But the small things, the good morning. The I was thinking about you today. The I noticed you seemed tired. Let me do the dishes. Those are the ones that actually build something. And because they say I'm paying attention even when there's nothing dramatic Tuesday, the research supports Brian's instinct completely. And the ratio of positive to negative interactions in a healthy relationship, what Gottman called the magic ratio, is roughly 5:1. 5 positive interactions for every one negative one. But the crucial thing the research shows is that the positive interactions do not need to be large. They can be tiny. A smile across a room, a genuine question about the other person's day, a shared moment of humor, a hand briefly held. Small things reliably offered, and create the emotional bank account that makes the couple resilient when the difficult moments arrive, because the account is full enough to absorb a withdrawal without going into deficit. Romeo and Juliet never get to build this. Their love is entirely made of grand gestures because they never have any other kind of moment. Every interaction between them is charged with the awareness of the impossible situation surrounding them. Ever get to have a dull evening together. They never get to be boring in each other's company. They never get to discover each other's irritating small habits and decide they can live with them. Their love is perfect and burning, and completely without the ordinary. And the ordinary, as it turns out, is where the deepest love actually lives. This is not a sad thing. Ultimately, it is an honest one. The ordinary is not the diminishment of the extraordinary. It is where the extraordinary chooses to live, when it has a chance to settle and breathe, and the choice to show up small and consistently, and without fanfare to the ordinary moments of a shared life. That choice made again and again by two people who have decided each other is worth the choosing is not less than Romeo's speech beneath the balcony. It is the balcony speech translated into the language of real time. That's the whole story. That's everything this story set out to say. And the only thing left is to say it directly one more time before you close the file, or turn off the screen, or go back to your own Tuesday. The love that changed literature forever was not a love that lasted. It was a love that was true, entirely beautifully and catastrophically true. And that burned so bright and so short a time that it lit up 400 years of human wondering. What you do with that wonder is the question the play leaves in your hands. What you build in ordinary time with the people you have chosen, that is the answer. Go build it. Before we go back to Verona, let's stay in that apartment for just one more minute. Not Sarah's apartment. Not Marcus's. Yours. Think about the last time you felt something you could not explain to anyone who wasn't inside it with you. A feeling for another person that was too big, or too specific, or too complicated to reduce to a sentence. The feeling that when you tried to describe it to a friend came out smaller than it was. That gap between what you feel and what language can hold. That gap is where this whole story lives. Shakespeare understood something about that gap, and 400 years later, so does everyone who has ever tried to text someone they love and given up and called instead. Let's go back to Verona. Before we move into what the science of love actually shows us about what Romeo's brain was doing at that party, let's plant a question you don't need to answer yet, but that you should hold. The question is, not what do you believe, genuinely believe, not what you think you're supposed to believe about the relationship between intensity and truth in love. Is a love that feels overwhelming more likely to be real than one that builds slowly? Or is intensity actually a poor guide to depth? Hold that in, because what the research shows is going to push on whatever answer you arrived at just now, and I want you to have a position to push against. Here's a thing worth sitting with for a moment before we get to Friar Lawrence. Every person who has ever loved another person has also at some point loved them imperfectly, has done something in the name of love that did not serve the person being loved. Not maliciously, in good faith, and with the best intentions, and the most genuine desire to help. And the results have not always been what the intentions called for. And that experience of loving well and still getting it wrong is one of the most universal human experiences there is. And it is also one of the least talked about, because admitting it requires the particular vulnerability of being accountable for your own kindness. The friar is about to show us what that looks like at its most tragic. Stay with me. And here's the uncomfortable truth about the street scene where Mercutio and Tybalt die. Nobody in that scene is entirely wrong. Tybalt has a legitimate sense of violation. A member of the enemy family crashed his family's party. Mercutio is defending his friend's honor, which in his world is a genuine responsibility. Romeo is trying to prevent violence on the day of his wedding for reasons he cannot explain. The prince is trying to hold a city together that keeps tearing itself apart. In a scene full of people behaving according to their own completely coherent internal logic, two people still end up dead. That is not a nihilistic observation. It is an honest one, and it is the foundation of everything this chapter is going to tell you about conflict. We are about to go into the tomb, and I want to say before we do that, what we are going to find there is not primarily a tragedy about love failing. It is a tragedy about communication failing, about the gap between what is true and what one person knows about what is true, and about what happens when that gap becomes irreversible. The tomb is the most extreme version of something that happens in relationships every day. The moment when incomplete information and an inability to wait collide into a decision that cannot be undone. And the stakes in the play are life and death. In your own life, the stakes are usually smaller, but the mechanism is the same. That's what makes it matter. 4 centuries after it was written, we have looked now at the whole arc of this story, from the first party through the secret marriage, through the street fight and the banishment, through the tomb. We have looked at limerence and attachment styles and good intentions. and the four horsemen and confirmation bias and grief. And what we have found underneath all of it is not a lesson about what not to do. Now, it is a picture of what love requires that is more complete, more honest, and more demanding than any simple moral lesson could be. Now, let's talk about what to do with that picture. Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet when he was roughly 30 years old. He had been married for about 12 years at that point, to a woman named Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years older than him, who lived in Stratford while he worked in London, who he saw maybe a few months a year. Their marriage was complicated, distant by circumstance, and we know almost nothing true about the emotional texture of it. And what we do know is that a man who had been living inside a real marriage with its distances and compromises and ordinary imperfections sat down and wrote the most celebrated love story in the history of the English language, about two teenagers who loved each other for 5 days and then died. There is something in that biographical fact that I find very moving, and I am not entirely sure why. Maybe it is because it suggests that the extraordinary love in the play was not a transcription of something Shakespeare had. Maybe it was a reaching towards something, a thinking through of what love could be, and what gets in the way, and what is lost when the world does not give the feeling room to become something more than feeling. Maybe Shakespeare, not sitting in London in the 1590s far from home and his wife, in whatever complicated reality his marriage contained, wrote Romeo and Juliet as an act of longing, not for a specific person, but for the conditions under which love might become everything it is capable of being. If that's true, then the play is not just a tragedy about two teenagers. It is a letter written across 400 years from one ordinary married person to every ordinary person who has ever loved him perfectly and wanted to do it better. And that letter says, I know the feeling is real. Obstacles are real. The loss is real. Now take what's real, and take the time you have and do the work that turns the feeling into the thing that actually lasts. That's the whole letter. That's the story. That's why it changed everything and keeps changing everything. That's why we are still here. Priya and Tom lived on opposite sides of an ocean for the first 2 years of their relationship. And they will tell you now that the distance nearly destroyed the thing it eventually helped build. They met at a conference, spent 4 days, completely absorbed in each other, and then flew home to different continents with nothing but a time zone chart and a shared conviction that this was worth trying. The early months had a strange kinship with the balcony scene. All of it happening at a distance. All of it conducted through language rather than presence, every word doing the work that touch would normally do. Then the ordinary problem of long-distance love set in, the one nobody warns you about clearly enough. Absence does not just create longing. It also creates a story-shaped hole, and two people on opposite sides of the world will fill that hole with whatever their own fears supply. Tom went quiet for a few days during a hard stretch at work, and Priya, working from a version of the same confirmation bias that undid Romeo in the tomb, decided the silence meant he had quietly moved on and simply hadn't found the words to say so. She spent a week rehearsing a breakup conversation that Tom had no idea was coming. When he finally called, exhausted and apologetic about a deadline, he found a woman already halfway out the door of a relationship he thought was steady. It took most of that call, and several more after it, for Priya to admit what she had built in her head during his silence, and for Tom to understand that his ordinary human need to disappear into work for a few days had cost them both something neither of them intended. What saved them was not more contact. It was a rule they built together afterward. If either of them went quiet for more than 2 days, the other one was allowed to ask directly, plainly, without apology, what is actually going on right now, rather than quietly writing the ending themselves. Priya calls it their tomb rule, because it exists specifically to stop either of them from acting on a story instead of a fact. They are married now, in the same city at last, and Priya says the years of distance taught them something couples who start out sharing an apartment rarely have to learn early: how to ask the direct question instead of drafting the eulogy. That is why we are still here. There is something about Verona that gets lost in every high school classroom discussion of this, that gets lost in every high school classroom discussion of this play. and it is worth recovering before we go further. Verona in the 1500s was a real functioning complex city, one of the most prosperous in the region. A city of trade and art and ecclesiastical power, and also simultaneously a city with a documented history of intra-family and inter-family violence that modern historians have spent considerable time excavating. And the private feuds that shaped civic life in Renaissance Italian cities were not simply colorful backdrop for a playwright's imagination. They were structural features of a social order in which law enforcement as we understand it did not exist, in which personal and family honor functioned as a currency whose value had to be defended or it depreciated, and in which violence was one of the primary mechanisms by which social status and personal safety were maintained. What this means for Romeo and Juliet understood in its historical context is something slightly different from what it means understood through a modern lens. The feud is not irrational. It is not simply ancient hatred for its own sake. It is a rational response to a social environment in which the alternative to being feared is being victimized. The families fight because, in a world without reliable external protection, your family's reputation for willingness to fight is part of what keeps your family safe. The fight itself is irrational and cruel and self-perpetuating. The logic that produces the fight is within its context coherent. This matters because it means that when Romeo tries to step between Mercutio and Tybalt, he is not just doing something emotionally difficult. He is doing something socially impossible, and he is trying to act according to a set of values. Peace, restraint, the belief that the future can be different from the past, that the social order around him has no framework to accommodate. He is in the truest sense ahead of his time, and his contemporaries who have no framework for what he is trying to do read his restraint as weakness and act accordingly. Now project this forward. Number of situations in which good people try to act according to values that their immediate social environment has no framework for is not small. Person who tries to introduce honest conversation into a family culture that has always managed conflict through avoidance. The employee who tries to raise a genuine concern in a workplace culture that treats all criticism as disloyalty. The child of immigrants who tries to bridge two value systems that were not designed to coexist. These are not failures of personal will. They are structural situations in which the individual is trying to operate according to a different logic from the system around them. And the system, like Mercutio, reads the difference as weakness and treats it accordingly. What Romeo needed in that street was not simply more courage or better judgment. He needed a community. Even one other person who shared his values and could make them visible in the moment. Who could have said alongside him, this doesn't have to end this way. And he needed what every person trying to live differently from their environment needs. Not just internal commitment, but external witnesses and reinforcement. He didn't have it. And the isolation of good values in a hostile environment is across 400 years in many different kinds of streets. One of the consistent ways that good intentions get overwhelmed by the systems they are trying to change. Juliet is 14 in the play. This is a detail that modern readers often find difficult to sit with, and understandably so. And the relationship between the play's treatment of Juliet's age and our contemporary understanding of adolescence and consent is genuinely complicated, and it is worth spending some time with it, rather than either dismissing it as historical convention or applying our contemporary framework to it without nuance. In Shakespeare's time and in the Italian source material, he drew from marriage at 14. For girls of the noble class was not unusual, though it was also not universal. The social context was one in which the concept of adolescence as a protected developmental stage did not exist. Children became adults socially and legally significantly earlier, and the expectations placed on them reflected that. Juliet, in the context of her world, is navigating the full weight of adult social expectation, an arranged marriage, family honor, a civic conflict at an age that our contemporary psychology would identify as still years away from full cognitive development. What Shakespeare does with this, which is interesting and worth noting, is give Juliet a level of clarity and self-knowledge that frequently exceeds the adult characters around her. It is Juliet who pauses in the famous balcony scene to note that everything is happening too rash, too sudden, too like the lightning. It is Juliet who asked Romeo not to swear his love by the moon, the inconstant moon. It is Juliet who, in the face of her father's rage and the nurse's betrayal, in the friar's inadequate plan, makes clear-eyed assessments of her situation, with a precision that the adults around her almost never match. Shakespeare is doing something deliberately paradoxical, putting the most incisive emotional intelligence in the character, who by the logic of her world has the least social power. Juliet is the wisest person in the play, and also the least able to act on that wisdom, without the world's permission, which the world withholds entirely. This resonates across historical contexts in ways that are not comfortable, but that are honest. The experience of having clear understanding and no power to act on it, of seeing the situation correctly and being unable to change it, because the structures around you require your compliance with a reality you can see is wrong, is not a historical curiosity. It is the experience of a great many people in a great many kinds of structural positions across many different kinds of social arrangements. Juliet is a specific historical character on own. She is also a template for anyone who has ever been the most perceptive person in the room and the least powerful to act on that perception. There is something painful and also something clarifying about reading Juliet this way. It asks you to look at the people in your own life who may be seeing clearly but speaking into a structure that is not designed to hear them. Younger people, people with less institutional power, are people whose social position has trained the people around them to hear their clarity as naivety, rather than wisdom. And it asks whether you are one of the people in the room who might make a different choice from Lord Capulet, who might stop and actually listen before the clarity that is right in front of you goes underground and then goes catastrophically wrong. There is a moment after Romeo dies and before Juliet wakes, a moment of maybe 15 or 20 seconds in any good production. A silence in the text. A space between two devastating events in which the audience sits in a kind of suspended horror. Because we know she is going to wake. We know she is going to find him. We know there is nothing we can do. We are watching helplessly as the last possible moment for intervention closes. That experience of watching someone you cannot reach, make or be about to make an irreversible decision, is one of the specific emotional experiences that theater was invented to create. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is necessary. Because the human organism needs to have experiences of helplessness that are real in emotional terms, but contained in practical terms. Experiences that produce the feeling without the consequence, so that the feeling can be processed and integrated rather than avoided. The ancient Greek theorist Aristotle wrote about this in the context of tragedy, using the term catharsis, a purging or purification through the experience of intense emotion in a safe theatrical context. The audience cries for Romeo and Juliet. They feel the grief and the horror and the waste of it, and they walk out into the night air and into their own lives, carrying something they did not have when they walked in. Not a lesson exactly, something harder to name, a kind of emotional calibration and a sense of having been reminded of what matters through the experience of watching it be lost. This is in the end what makes this story worth 210 minutes of your time. Not the information in it, useful as that information is. Not the research citations, or the modern case studies, or the 5 truths at the end. The thing that no other format can provide, and that the story provides completely, is the experience of feeling it, of riding alongside 2 teenagers through 5 impossible days, and caring what happens to them, and knowing the whole time that you cannot change it, and feeling that helplessness as something real and full and instructive. That experience lives in your body after this story ends. It changes the quality of attention you bring to your own relationships in small and invisible ways that are real, even if they are difficult to articulate. That's the final thing this story is built to do, not to inform you about love, to make you feel it more clearly, the value of it, the fragility of it, the cost of the conditions that don't support it, and to send you back into your own life with that clarity intact, for as long as it stays with you before the ordinary day reasserts itself, and the feeling settles into the background. It will settle. The feeling always does. Own. But while it is present, act on it. Tell the true thing, make the call, do the small work, show up small. Consistently on the ordinary Tuesdays. Build the account, make the repair. The story has done what it can. The rest is yours. Own. There is a specific kind of love story that never gets told in films or plays or novels because it is too ordinary and too quiet to carry a plot. It is the story of the couple who almost didn't make it. Not because of any grand tragedy, own, but simply because of accumulated distance, accumulated unspoken things, own. Accumulated Tuesdays that were too tired, and Sundays that were too busy, and years that went by before anyone said out loud that the person they married was starting to feel like a stranger. These stories do not end in a tomb, own. They end sometimes in a divorce that comes as a quiet shock to everyone who had always thought of that couple as solid. Or, they end in the late-night conversation that changes everything, own. The one where someone finally says the true thing, and the other person finally hears it, and the marriage becomes something different from what it had become. Something more honest, more careful, more intentional. Those stories are everywhere, own. They just do not make the news. David and Marianne have been married 24 years. They have 3 children, a house they love, a life that from the outside has always looked stable and good. Own. 6 years ago they came within 3 months of separation. Not because either of them was unkind. Not because of betrayal. Not because the love was gone. Because they had, without noticing, stopped talking to each other as people, own, and started communicating exclusively as co-managers of a household and a family. We had a system, David says, a very efficient system. Who handles what? Who pays which bill? Who calls the school? We were incredibly well organized, own. We just weren't together, not in the way that mattered. Marianne describes it as a kind of slow disappearing, own. I didn't notice it happening until one day I was on the phone with my sister, and she asked how David was, and I realized I didn't actually know. I knew what was on his schedule. I knew what he was stressed about at work, own. I didn't know how he was inside because we hadn't asked each other that in years. The thing that saved them was not, David says, a dramatic intervention. It was one conversation on an ordinary Saturday morning, own. That started with Marianne saying, "I miss you," and David not immediately deflecting or joking or saying he didn't know what she meant. He sat with it. He said, "I know, I miss you too, own." And then they just not about the children or the mortgage or the schedule, about themselves. About who they had been when they got married, and who they had become and what they wanted, and what they were afraid of. It lasted 3 hours, own. By the end of it, they had not solved anything, but they had re-established something they had not even noticed. They had lost the sense that the other person was actually present, actually there, on paying attention, own. And not to the logistics of their shared life, but to them specifically as a person. That conversation was not romantic. David says it was kind of terrifying, actually. We said things that were uncomfortable, own. We heard things that were uncomfortable, but it was real. And we had not been real with each other in a very long time. The marriage did not transform overnight. Odd, own. The habits that had accumulated over years do not dissolve in a single Saturday morning. But that conversation was the beginning of a practice of checking in. Not about the household, own. Not about the calendar that they have maintained imperfectly and inconsistently, but genuinely ever since, own. What David and Marianne did on that ordinary Saturday morning is what Romeo and Juliet might have done on an ordinary Saturday morning in their 30s, if the world had given them the chance. Not poetry, not grand gesture, a real conversation, own. The willingness to be uncomfortable, a choice to show up honestly to someone you love, rather than maintaining the comfortable performance of a life shared well, own. Those things are not less than the balcony speech, and they are, the balcony speech, translated into the language of the long marriage, and they are harder, and they are more important, own. They are what keeps the story going when the intensity has settled into something quieter and more durable. Here is something that happens with this story that does not happen with many others, own. People who encounter it at different ages encounter different plays. The 14-year-old in the classroom reads a love story and a tragedy, own. The 25-year-old who has recently been through something that felt like it might end. The way the play ends reads a story about survival and communication failure. And the things that could have been different, own. A 45-year-old who has been married for 15 years reads a story about what they almost lost and what they still have. Own. The 60-year-old who has lost someone real reads a story about grief and the irreversibility of certain moments and the way that certain absences reshape everything that comes after them. Own. A play gives back different things at different moments of a life on. This is not unique to Romeo and Juliet. It is a quality of all great literature. Own. But it is particularly pronounced in this story because the subject matter is something every human being lives in one form or another across the entire arc of a life. Love does not stop being relevant. Loss does not stop being instructive. Own. The question of what it costs to love honestly and completely, and with the whole weight of yourself, does not become less pressing at 60 than it was at 20. It becomes, if anything, more pressing because the time remaining to act on the answer is shorter and therefore more valuable. Chris is 67, retired, widowed 3 years ago after 41 years of marriage to a woman named Donna. He has read Romeo and Juliet, he says probably 15 times over the course of his life. For one reason or another, class assignments, productions his children were in, evenings when the television felt like not enough, and he wanted something that actually cost him something. He says the reading he did 6 months after Donna died was the most different from any reading he had done before. It didn't feel like a love story anymore. Chris says it felt like a grief story. It felt like a story about what you have and then what you don't have, and the specific quality of that absence. Not the dramatic grief of Romeo in the tomb. The other kind, the quiet kind. The Tuesday morning kind when you put on the coffee and you are already missing that other person before you have even fully woken up. And he says the thing the play gave him that reading was unexpected, not comfort. Exactly. More like company. The sense that the specific loss of the specific person, not love in the abstract, but this love, this person, this particular absence that has a particular shape, had been felt in some form before. Had been written about, had been sat with by someone who found language for it. I know it's a fictional grief, Chris says. I know Romeo and Juliet are not real. But grief is not rational. And something in reading it made me feel less alone in what I was carrying, and less like the loss was something that had happened only to me in the history of people experiencing loss. That is the final gift this story gives, and it is the one that belongs to no research framework and no therapeutic model. It is simply the gift of company. The sense that the thing you are feeling, whatever form it takes, whatever version of love or loss, or the desire for something more honest and more true than what you currently have, has been felt before and given words before and survived before, by someone who then sat down and wrote those words, in a form that has now outlasted everything else about the world they lived in. The world of Verona is gone. The feuds and the street violence and the arranged marriages and the absolute power of fathers over daughters are mostly historical artifacts. The love is not gone. The grief is not gone. The desire for something real and complete and honestly lived that is not gone. That apparently is permanent. And that is why now, 420 years after a working playwright in London sat down with an old poem about 2 teenagers from Italy and decided to compress their entire story into 5 days, the story is still here, still doing its work on still sending people back into their own lives with better questions than they arrived with. Still somehow being exactly what it was always trying to be, a companion for the parts of being human that do not have easier.